Across the world, there are places where science meets silence. Deserts, glaciers, jungles and seas that still hold secrets. In these places, some of the brightest minds on Earth went searching for answers and never came back. This is the story of 21 scientists and explorers who vanished while studying the unknown. Their work changed what we know about the world. Their disappearances remind us how little of it we truly control. Daniel Robinson, 2021, Arizona Desert. It was a clear morning in late June 2021, the kind of dry heat that builds early in the Arizona desert. 24-year-old Daniel Robinson started his workday at a remote drill site near Buckeye, west of Phoenix. He was a young geologist passionate about fieldwork, fascinated by the layers of earth and rock beneath the desert floor. Those who worked with him described him as quiet, focused, and dependable. That morning, he spoke briefly with a co-worker, gave a small wave, got into his blue-grey Jeep Renegade, and drove away. It was just after 9 o'clock. That was the last time anyone saw him. For a while, no one thought much of it. Field geologists sometimes moved between sites, but hours passed, then a full day, and Daniel didn't come home. He didn't answer calls, texts, or emails. By the next morning, his father, who lived across the country in South Carolina, filed a missing person report with the Buckeye Police Department. That was June 24th, 2021. Search teams began the next day. They combed through miles of desert, following tire tracks, scanning ravines, and circling above in helicopters. The area was a harsh landscape, endless sand, scrub brush, and jagged rocks under temperatures that reached more than 110 degrees. There were no landmarks, no shade, and little chance for survival without water. Every hour that passed made the search feel more urgent. Nearly a month later, on July 19th, a rancher noticed something odd. A vehicle had appeared in a remote ravine west of the worksite, a place he said he had checked before. When authorities arrived, they found Daniel's Jeep flipped on its side, airbags deployed. The windows were shattered. The vehicle had rolled over and come to rest deep in the wash, hidden from the road. Inside were Daniel's wallet, keys, cell phone, and clothes. The ignition was still in the on position, and the airbags showed signs of multiple deployments. But Daniel wasn't there. No footprints led away, no signs of blood, no drag marks, no indication that anyone had left on foot. Just the vehicle, silent, scorched by the sun, and abandoned. The police examined the scene and considered it a single vehicle accident. They believed Daniel might have wandered off injured or disoriented, but his father, David Robinson, thought otherwise. He hired a private investigator who noticed things that didn't fit. The vehicle's internal data showed more than 40 ignition cycles after the airbags deployed, meaning someone had turned it on and off many times after the crash. There was also a streak of red paint on the Jeep's exterior, possibly from another vehicle. To the investigator, it looked less like an accident and more like the scene had been moved or tampered with. If that was true, the question became why, and who could have done it? As searchers expanded the grid, they discovered human remains scattered miles from the crash site. For a brief moment, hope turned to dread. But DNA testing revealed they did not belong to Daniel. 2 more discoveries of bones followed in the next months, and both were ruled out as well. The desert was full of secrets, but none of them answered where Daniel had gone. The investigation into his personal life raised new questions. He'd recently met a woman while working a delivery job in Phoenix. He texted her a few times, even showed up at her home unannounced, which made her uncomfortable. She asked him not to contact her again. Friends said Daniel had seemed different after that, quiet, distracted, maybe heartbroken. Still, no one described him as unstable or suicidal. He loved his work and had no reason to vanish. Police reviewed his apartment. His personal items were there, untouched except for his laptop. Data logs showed someone had accessed it after he disappeared. It wasn't clear who. The mystery deepened. Weeks turned into months. His father refused to give up. He left his job in South Carolina and moved to Arizona to lead the search himself. He organised volunteers, drones, dogs, and off-road teams to sweep through miles of open desert. Some searches found animal bones, others found nothing at all. The area was unforgiving, vast and open by day, pitch black and cold at night. After 2 years, the Buckeye Police Department had received dozens of tips, but still no solid leads. Daniel's Jeep was sent for forensic testing. Investigators could not confirm whether Daniel had been driving when it crashed. They also couldn't prove anyone else had been inside. The private investigator continued to push the theory that the crash was staged, possibly to cover up foul play. Police acknowledged the anomalies but maintained there was no definitive evidence of a crime. As of 2025, more than 4 years later, Daniel Robinson remains missing. His father still organised his searches. In interviews, he says he can't accept the idea that his son simply disappeared into the desert. He believes someone knows what happened. The case file lists several theories. The first, an accident. Daniel might have crashed, survived, and wandered away in the heat, eventually succumbing to exposure. It's possible, though unlikely. Extensive searches, cadaver dogs, and aerial sweeps found nothing. Even in the desert, some trace would normally remain. Clothing, a bone, a shoe, something. The second theory, foul play. If someone harmed Daniel, the desert would be an easy place to hide evidence. The unusual condition of the Jeep supports the idea that the scene might have been manipulated. The multiple ignition cycles, the red paint, and the missing person entering his apartment later all add weight to this. But again, there are no witnesses, no clear suspects, and no confession. The third, voluntary disappearance. Could Daniel have chosen to walk away from his life? Investigators found no signs of financial trouble, no preparations, and no reason to vanish. His family dismisses the idea completely. They say Daniel was close to his siblings and had just started a promising career. In the years since, the desert around Buckeye has changed very little. The ravine where the Jeep was found is quiet, windswept, dotted with cactus and stone. Search parties still drive through occasionally, marking grids on maps, checking dry riverbeds, climbing ridges to scan the horizon. They still call his name into the wind, even though no one answers. For many, Daniel's case has come to represent something larger, the uncertainty that families of missing people live with when there are no clear answers, only evidence that doesn't add up. His father often says the desert holds the truth. It just hasn't given it back yet. There is no single piece of proof to explain where Daniel went that morning or why he left the drill site. Only fragments remain. A timestamp, a wrecked Jeep, a trail that stops in the sand, and a family still searching for their son. Dorbahuista, 1995, Nepal, India. The road to Yumla winds like a scar through the Himalayas. Long stretches of dirt and stone carve between cliffs where clouds hang low and the air feels heavy with silence. It was through this landscape that Dorbahuista made his last journey. Nepal's most famous anthropologist, a man who had spent his life documenting the cultures and castes of his country, vanished somewhere along this route in early 1995. He was 65 years old, still sharp, still curious, and still controversial. His book Fatalism and Development had challenged deeply rooted beliefs about why Nepal remained poor. He blamed the caste system, the fatalistic attitude of the elite, and the structure of power itself. His ideas made him a respected figure abroad, but an uneasy one at home. In the years before his disappearance, he'd been working far from Kathmandu, in Jumla, one of the most isolated regions in the country. Friends described him as restless, travelling constantly, moving between villages to record languages, rituals, and oral histories. In December 1994, he was in Jumla again. He had recently been planning new research on local governance and social reform. The winter was harsh that year, with snow already falling across the passes. Still, he continued to travel. Those who saw him in those days said he appeared thoughtful, sometimes distant, but focused. Then, near the end of the month, he said he was leaving for the southern plains. No one is sure what motivated this sudden departure. He didn't tell his colleagues in detail. He simply packed lightly and said he was heading toward the Terai, or perhaps into India. The next confirmed sighting came from Jumla's bus stand, where he was reportedly seen boarding a bus heading west. After that, the trail breaks apart into fragments. A few weeks later, villagers near Nepalgunj claimed they saw a man who looked like him walking alone, wearing a dark coat and carrying a notebook. Another story came from across the border, in the Indian pilgrimage city of Haridwar, where a Nepalese man matching his description was seen visiting an ashram. The witnesses there said he stayed quietly for several days, speaking to no one, and then left one morning at dawn. Whether this man was Dorbahuista has never been proven. Back in Kathmandu, his family grew worried when he stopped writing. He had always sent letters or messages to his daughter during his long trips, but weeks turned to months with no word. His home in Dobbigat was untouched. His suitcase was there, his notes and papers arranged neatly on his desk, and his clothes folded. His office line had been disconnected. There was no farewell letter, no sign of travel plans, no trace of money withdrawn from his accounts. By the spring of 1995, newspapers in Kathmandu began publishing small stories under the headline "Missing Anthropologist." Reporters called local police stations, asked at hospitals, checked border records, and found nothing. The National Police eventually opened an inquiry but released no results. For most officials, it seemed the case had no leads, just rumours. Some said he'd gone on a spiritual retreat, tired of politics and research. Others believed he might have been targeted for his writings, which criticised Nepal's ruling elites. Bista's ideas had challenged the social hierarchy. In Fatalism and Development, he'd written that the country could never progress until it abandoned caste privilege and fatalistic belief. In regions like Jumla, where old power structures were strong, his words were not well received. He had been known to argue openly with local authorities and powerful landowners. A few academics later speculated that he may have been threatened before his disappearance. There were whispers that he had made enemies, but no one ever produced evidence of violence or confrontation. Among those who admired him, another idea took hold, that he had chosen to disappear. The image of the scholar walking away from the world, leaving his name and life behind to live as an ascetic in India, appealed to some who knew his philosophical side. He often spoke of impermanence, of the futility of material ambition. In letters to colleagues, he once wrote that understanding society begins when you step outside it. To a few of his friends, this sounded like a man already thinking of withdrawal. But to his students and family, the theory felt hollow. He had projects underway, unfinished manuscripts, and an active teaching schedule. Years passed. Each so-called sighting turned into another dead end. A traveller claimed to have met him near the Ganges River in 1996, teaching children under a tree. A local journalist wrote that a Nepali hermit living near Rishikesh had introduced himself as Dor, but when others went to find him, he was gone. None of these accounts could be verified. In Nepal, meanwhile, his disappearance became part of cultural memory. Articles and essays speculated on his fate, turning the missing anthropologist into a symbol of the very fatalism he'd written against. Attempts to reopen the case in the 2000s brought little progress. There were no passport records proving he had crossed into India, no bus tickets bearing his name, no death certificate ever issued. His remains were never found, and there was never an official declaration of death. He simply ceased to exist in official files. In academic circles, he remained both present and absent, his work studied, his fate left open. The timeline still stands mostly empty. Late 1994, active in Jumla. Early 1995, seen boarding a bus. After that, silence. It is one of those cases where the distance between what is known and what is imagined is wide enough for myths to grow. Some colleagues believe he died of exposure in the mountains. Others think he crossed into India unnoticed and lived quietly in an ashram under another name. Few suspect darker forces, political retribution or abduction, but no evidence has surfaced to prove it. What makes his disappearance unusual is how untraceable it remains despite his prominence. Dr. Bahadur Bista was not an unknown traveller or a recluse. He was a public intellectual whose works were taught in schools. Yet he could vanish completely, leaving behind only his books and unanswered questions. His family still lives with that uncertainty. They have kept his papers preserved, his handwriting fading on notebooks that might have been meant for his next project. Friends occasionally visit the house and talk about the last time they saw him, how he smiled, how he seemed in good health, how nothing in his manner suggested that he was planning to disappear. In Nepal, some locals in Jumla still tell stories of an old man who once lived in a hut near the river, who spoke the local dialect perfectly and read in silence by candlelight. When asked who he was, they say he never gave his full name. Then, one winter he vanished too. It might have been anyone, it might have been no one. Vladimir Alexandrov, 1985, Spain. The sound of polite applause echoed through a small hall in Cordoba, Spain. It was late March 1985, and a Soviet scientist named Vladimir Valentinovich Alexandrov had just finished presenting his research. He was calm, precise and confident. Few in the audience realized they were witnessing one of his final public moments before he disappeared. Alexandrov was 47, a brilliant physicist from the Soviet Union, who had spent years studying the possible climate effects of nuclear war. His name was known across the scientific world for co-developing computer models that described what would later be called the nuclear winter scenario, a global freeze that could follow massive firestorms after a nuclear exchange. He had travelled between Moscow and the West for research, one of the few Soviet scientists trusted to visit American institutions during the Cold War. His access to Western computers and data made him both respected and watched. After the conference in Cordoba, Alexandrov travelled to Madrid. He was scheduled to return to Moscow soon after, but before his flight home he visited the Soviet embassy and went out that evening reportedly for dinner and drinks. According to the driver assigned to him, Alexandrov appeared relaxed but distracted, asking to stop by a restaurant and later a bingo hall near his hotel on Paseo de la Habana. That was the last confirmed time anyone saw him. The next morning he failed to appear for his scheduled meetings. His passport, airline ticket and luggage were still in his hotel room. No messages were sent, no calls made, no witnesses reported seeing him leave the building. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air in the centre of Madrid. The days that followed were filled with confusion and silence. Spanish police opened an inquiry, but there were few leads. The Soviet embassy gave vague and contradictory statements. One official said Alexandrov had already left Madrid and might be travelling to another European country. Another said he was missing but likely safe. The truth was that no one seemed to know where he'd gone, and perhaps more importantly, no one wanted to take responsibility for finding out. In Moscow, his colleagues were told little. Some quietly speculated that he had defected to the West, as a few Soviet scientists had done before him. Others believed he had been kidnapped, either by Western intelligence or his own government. Both possibilities seemed equally dangerous in 1985. The year of spies, secret files, and scientific politics. The mystery deepened when American scientists who had worked with Alexandrov began to speak out. They described him as brilliant, cautious, and deeply patriotic. He had never hinted at wanting to defect. On the contrary, he often spoke proudly of returning to Moscow and continuing his research. His work was politically sensitive but not secret. Still, in the paranoid atmosphere of the Cold War, a scientist who moved freely between the Soviet Union and the United States could easily become a target for suspicion from both sides. What happened in Madrid remains one of the Cold War's most unsettling disappearances. Some believe Alexandrov was abducted, taken by intelligence agents for reasons that remain classified. This theory is supported by the Soviet claim that the CIA may have been involved. Others think he was eliminated by his own government, perhaps because his research had drawn too much attention abroad, or because he had revealed information considered sensitive. There are also simpler theories, that he was depressed, that he walked away voluntarily, that he died accidentally somewhere in the city and his body was never found. But these explanations fail to match the details. His personal belongings were untouched, his hotel room undisturbed. No one reported a body that matched his description, and no passport or travel record shows that he crossed any border. The story becomes stranger when you look at his career in the years leading up to his disappearance. In 1982, Alexandrov was invited to the United States to collaborate with American scientists on atmospheric modelling. He worked at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Colorado, using advanced supercomputers to simulate the effects of nuclear war. Those machines were among the fastest in the world, and his access was rare for a Soviet citizen. The project he co-led predicted catastrophic global cooling after nuclear conflict, a finding that alarmed both governments. Back home, his work was praised in public but quietly questioned by officials. Some in the Soviet establishment believed the nuclear winter theory gave the West propaganda material against the arms race. Others thought it weakened the Soviet image of technological control. Alexandrov continued his research, but it became increasingly political. He was navigating the fine line between science and state loyalty, between discovery and secrecy. By 1984, tension surrounded his travels. American scientists later said that US authorities restricted his access to certain computing systems, fearing he might collect classified data. In Moscow, rumours circulated that he was under surveillance by his own security services, yet he kept travelling, attending conferences and presenting papers. He was a scientist caught between two superpowers, both curious about what he knew and both distrustful of how he might use it. When he disappeared, the reaction in the scientific community was shock and disbelief. Some of his colleagues reached out to Spanish police and Interpol. Others wrote letters to journals and embassies demanding investigation. The responses were vague. No official agency in Spain, the Soviet Union, or the United States ever released a conclusive report. The trail ended abruptly with his last night in Madrid. Over the following months, stories circulated. One claimed that he'd been seen in North Africa under a different name. Another suggested he'd boarded a ship bound for South America. A Soviet news report hinted that he'd defected, though no evidence was presented. In the United States, his friends dismissed that claim, saying he was too devoted to his work in Moscow and to his family to abandon them. The case soon faded from headlines. The Cold War continued, and other crises took its place. Yet for those who worked with Alexandrov, his disappearance never felt like a simple accident or voluntary act. He was too well known, too closely watched, and too connected to powerful institutions for his vanishing to go unnoticed by intelligence services. The lack of official answers, even decades later, suggests that someone decided the truth should remain buried. His family in Moscow never received any message or remains. They were told nothing by the government. His daughter later said that the silence was the hardest part, not knowing whether he had betrayed his country, been betrayed by it, or simply been caught between two invisible hands. In scientific literature, Alexandrov's name remains attached to early nuclear winter studies, but his story is often reduced to a single line. Disappeared in Madrid, 1985. Behind that line lies a web of unanswered questions. What happened after he left the embassy? Who was the last person to see him alive? Was he taken, silenced, or simply lost? Michael Rockefeller, 1961, New Guinea. The map shows a narrow corridor of sea and jungle. On one side, the Arafura Sea, tides shifting and currents strong. On the other, the tidal rivers of the Asmat coast of southwestern New Guinea, a place few outsiders had ever studied. It was here, in November 1961, that Michael Rockefeller made his last journey. He was 23 years old, from one of America's richest families, but for him the wealth did not lie in business. It lay in exploring and collecting and understanding cultures at the edge of the known world. In the months before his disappearance, Michael had travelled for Harvard's Peabody Museum to the remote Asmat region of Dutch New Guinea, now part of Indonesia. His goal, to collect art and document the culture of a people still only marginally in contact with the outside world. He arrived with his boat, supplies, a small team. He saw villages where carved poles were raised after headhunting raids, rivers choked with vines, swampy forest where crocodiles lurked, and villagers who welcomed trade but still lived by their own laws. On November 18, 1961, Michael and Dutch anthropologist René Vassing were part of a small expedition. Their route, from the village of Agates along the coast to the remote rivers where the Asmat lived. The catamaran or dugout twin-hull craft they were using became caught in heavy waves, capsized, and was swept off the shore. Vassing clung to the wreck until help arrived. Michael decided to swim for land. According to Vassing, sometime the next morning, Michael said calmly, "I think I can make it." He constructed a makeshift float from a jerry can and boat gas tank, and he began to swim towards shore. Vassing's last sight of him, a head and the two cans, steadily moving towards land, then disappearing beneath the jungle horizon. That moment marks the map-room chase, the line of drift, the last known point, the shore he aimed for, the jungle beyond. Search planes flew over the rivers, ships and outboard canoes scouted the shoreline, but no trace of Michael was ever seen. The currents were strong, tides reversed. The swamp had hidden inlets and thick mangrove forests where a man could vanish. The map records the region, the Bisjay Pole villages, the tidal flats, the narrow channels where boats could not reach, swamp conditions undercut by heavy rains. And in those margins, Michael stepped into the unknown. The search was intense. The Dutch colonial authorities, the Australian Navy, American reconnaissance all joined, but no body, no belongings, no confirmed sighting emerged. Over the years, however, another layer of records grew, the witness patchwork. As decades passed, missionaries, villagers, journalists and authors dug into local oral testimony. Some of those accounts described Michael reaching shore, but being taken by villagers in the remote Asmat village of Otsjanep. Allegedly, they said the man was wearing only underwear, was wounded, and then killed in retaliation for earlier killings in the area. Some claimed his bones were used to craft weapons, his skull passed among men. Others claimed he simply drowned and the story of cannibalism was myth or misinterpretation of ritual. Let's sketch some of the key witness fragments. Decades after the event, in 2014, the journalist Carl Hoffman published a book which included interviews with Asmat elders who told similar stories. A pale-skinned man swimming ashore, being carried away by a party of men, then disappearing in the jungle. These local stories were consistent enough to raise serious questions. At the same time, Michael's twin sister wrote that she believed her brother drowned, and that the darker stories were rumours. The family official cause of death remains drowning. He was declared legally dead in 1964. The absence of remains casts a shadow. Another witness thread, Dutch missionary records from the 1960s mention that after a headhunting expedition in 1958 in the same region, the Asmat villagers believed in carrying out revenge cycles. In the village of Otsionep, it was claimed someone from the outside war party in 1958 killed 5 villagers. According to the oral tradition, when Michael's expedition arrived, an outsider in their view, one of the elders said it was time to settle debts. These are anecdotal but repeated in several sites visited by investigators. The map shows Otsionep situated inland from the coast, on a riverbank, accessible only by canoe through narrow channels. If Michael reached shore, the route into this village would have been difficult but not impossible, by long swim, wading, riverboat and jungle track. The map gives chilling context. Strong currents, swamp vegetation, hidden paths. The ledger of evidence here is mixed. On one side, capsized boat off the coast, Michael swimming, international search, no body found. On the other, local verbal accounts of ritual murder, anthropological context of headhunting and cannibalism among the Asmat people until the 1950s and early 60s. The Asmat themselves had only recently been contacted by outsiders, and their culture included severe rites of vengeance and skull displays. The map reminds us how remote the riverine villages were, how easy it would be to vanish from outside view. The jungle can hide tracks, swamp can obscure remains, and cultural silence can protect secrets. Let's pick through the pieces. Michael's expedition was collecting art, moving between villages, staying in canoes, dealing with heavy waves and tides. His craft overturned some 12 miles from shore, or 2 to 3 miles depending on accounts. He decided to swim, a risky choice in shark-infested seas. His companion survived, his guides did not accompany him. That's point A. Point B, he disappears. Point C, search begins but fails. The map suggests many places where a person could slip into the forest and be untraceable. Then the witness patchwork suggests he may have reached land and been captured. Key witness piece. The testimony by Dutch missionary Wim van der Waal in December 1961 told of village men in Otsionep, who claimed they possessed Michael's skull with no lower jaw and hole in the temple. They spoke of using his skull in ritual practice. To many this is sensational, but from local anthropology's perspective it fits known practices of the region at the time: ritual violence, body parts preserved in sacred caches. Another piece. The Asmat people's own history of headhunting and cannibalism is well documented by anthropologists, so the context supports the possibility of these accounts being credible, or at least plausible. At the same time, the family's position matters. They believe Michael drowned. They say there is no verifiable proof of ritual killing. For decades, no new leads came. The map shows the terrain as almost unsearchable. Mangrove swamps, tidal rivers, shifting mud, dense forest. The search parties could only cover so much, and witness testimony, decades later, is subject to memory, translation, social change. Yet the patchwork of stories across different villages adds weight. In the ledger we note, examiners found no body, no personal effect recovered clearly. Michael's clothes, camera, art collection all remain missing or unaccounted for. That absence is unusual for an accidental drowning where the body might wash ashore or be seen. On the other hand, others argue tides and currents in the Arafura Sea could very well have taken him far out to sea, making recovery impossible. The map does show outgoing tides that afternoon was strong. The witness accounts indicate possible ashore fate. The ledger notes stories but lacks physical evidence. Let's also mark the timeline. November 18, 1961, the capsizing. Michael enters sea at dawn. Search begins soon after. By late November, huge search. Ships, planes, helicopters, local canoes. By early December, search is called off. In 1964, he is declared legally dead. Over the decades, new investigations. Journalist Carl Hoffman in 2014 visits villages, records interviews, finds archival Dutch reports stating the Dutch government suppressed mention of cannibalism to protect colonial image. The ledger says suppressed records, buried files. The map shows the region: remote Asmat River, Otsjanep inland, forest thick, villages small. Depth of isolation helps explain why no concrete conclusion emerges. Witness patchwork includes villagers' multiple independent statements about Michael's presence, but none of these have been formally verified to hold remains, DNA, or bones traceable to him. The map-room chase shows final known point at sea, then wide unknown region of jungle and river. The intersection of these two frameworks points out the core of the mystery. He left the sea, entered inaccessible land, disappeared from human record. Another important piece. Michael's twin sister in her book later wrote about her grief and her belief in drowning scenario. The family archive notes Michael's last letters describing the Asmat culture, his fascination with their wood carving, his note of the puzzle of that society. He wrote, "The Asmat is like a huge puzzle, variations in ceremony and art style forming the pieces." He had planned to return to New York with a major collection of Asmat art and photographs, but that mission turned into a disappearance. The ledger records also that the artifacts he collected, and many from that journey, ended up in museum collections. The map shows New Guinea, the Asmat coast, the village roads, canoe tracks, and highlights how far one must go to reach human witnesses. It also shows how nature works: tides, crocodiles, swamp factors that hamper recovery. What remains is this: a line drawn from boat to shore, then vanishing into forest. Stories whisper that he survived only to be taken by villagers seeking revenge or ritual enactment, or that he died in the sea and the bodies were never recovered. Either scenario is consistent with the map terrain and witness records, but neither is confirmed. David A. Johnston, 1980, Mount St. Helens Red Zone. The sky was pale over Mount St. Helens that Sunday morning, May 18th, 1980. At the edge of the blast zone, a young volcanologist named David A. Johnston sat inside a small trailer known as Coldwater 2. He was 30 years old, one of the United States Geological Survey's most dedicated field scientists, stationed just 6 miles north of the mountain's summit. The air smelled of sulfur and wet pine. The slopes below were quiet, but David knew that quiet could turn to violence at any moment. He had spent weeks watching the volcano swell. Instruments showed the north flank of the mountain bulging outward at an astonishing rate, more than 5 feet per day. Gas readings had spiked. Earthquakes trembled beneath the peak and snowmelt hissed into new fissures. Johnston was one of the first scientists to recognize that the bulge itself could collapse. He warned superiors that the north face could fail catastrophically. The area around the mountain had been closed to the public, labelled the Red Zone, but Johnston volunteered to stay within it. He wanted to keep recording data. That decision placed him directly in harm's way. He had rotated shifts with another volcanologist, Harry Glicken. The two had agreed that Johnston would cover that weekend so Glicken could write his dissertation. It was a simple trade at the time. David arrived at Coldwater 2 on Saturday evening, checked his instruments, made notes about the deformation patterns, and settled in for the night. He radioed the USGS office in Vancouver, Washington, just after 7 p.m. to confirm that everything was stable. His tone was calm, almost cheerful. At dawn, he stepped outside to a view of the mountain that must have felt unreal. The entire north face bulged like a balloon. He had breakfast, tested his radio, and began recording readings. Nothing in his notes suggests he expected that morning to be different. At 8:32 a.m., a magnitude 5.1 earthquake struck beneath the mountain. Seconds later, the north face of Mount St. Helens collapsed in one of the largest landslides ever recorded. The collapse released the pressure that had been building inside the volcano, and a lateral blast of gas, ash, and rock exploded northward at speeds over 600 kilometers per hour. Coldwater 2 was directly in its path. In those few seconds before the blast reached him, Johnston grabbed his radio. His voice came through clearly on the channel monitored by the Vancouver office. "Vancouver! Vancouver! This is it!" It was the warning his colleagues had feared and the confirmation that the eruption had begun. Those 6 words were the last anyone ever heard from him. The radio went silent. The next sound on the channel was static. The blast hit Coldwater 2 with unimaginable force. The wall of hot gas and rock stripped trees from the ridge, flattened forests, and buried everything under layers of ash. Helicopters scrambled toward the site minutes later, but could see nothing through the grey cloud. From the air, the entire north side of the mountain was gone. The place where Johnston had been stationed no longer existed. Rescue teams reached the area days later, when the ash settled enough for aircraft to land. The landscape had changed beyond recognition. Hills had disappeared. Rivers were clogged with fallen trees and mud. The ridge where Coldwater 2 once stood was buried beneath tens of feet of debris. The searchers found nothing. No trailer, no radio, no trace of the man who had spoken the first words of the eruption. Over the following weeks, the search expanded. Teams combed through miles of grey wasteland. They found vehicles from other victims, pieces of equipment, and fragments of cabins, but not Johnston. It was as if he had been erased by the same force he had spent his life trying to understand. His colleagues replayed his final transmission again and again, transcribing every syllable. Those words, "This is it," became part of scientific history, a last call that captured both warning and acceptance. For those who knew him, it wasn't dramatic. It was typical of Johnston, direct, professional, focused on observation even at the edge of disaster. In the months that followed, fragments of his equipment were discovered, scattered across the devastated terrain. Pieces of the observation trailer were eventually found years later during highway construction, but there was still no sign of human remains. The eruption had vaporized everything in its immediate path. David Johnston's story is preserved not just in records, but in the geography itself. The place where he made his observations, Coldwater Ridge, was later renamed in his honor. His colleagues built a new observatory and called it the David A. Johnston Cascades Volcano Observatory. His final message is engraved there, overlooking the rebuilt forest and the scarred mountain that took his life. The official timeline is precise. Saturday night, last radio check, no signs of distress. Sunday morning, 8:32 a.m. Earthquake, flank collapse, lateral blast. Within seconds, communication ceases. Search begins. Nothing recovered. Declared missing, presumed dead. There is no mystery about what killed him. The physics of the blast are well understood, but the absence of his body and the total destruction of the observation post have turned his disappearance into a symbol. His colleagues often say he became part of the mountain's history, absorbed into its eruption. What makes Johnston's story stand out is not only the tragedy, but also his role in predicting it. Weeks earlier, he'd stood before reporters and said, "Mount St. Helens is a powder keg." His warnings convinced authorities to restrict access, saving countless lives. Without his persistence, the death toll could have been far higher. He knew the risks and chose to stay so that data could be collected until the very last moment. On that morning, when the mountain erupted, his voice was the first to carry across the radio waves. The eruption would go on to devastate over 200 square miles of land, send ash around the globe, and mark one of the most studied volcanic events in modern science. Johnston's call was its starting point, the signal that transformed years of warnings into reality. The search for him ended formally later that summer. His name was placed among the 57 people killed or missing. But among volcanologists, his case stands apart because it captures the fine line between science and danger, between curiosity and the forces that cannot be controlled. In later interviews, his colleagues said they still hear that moment when the radio went silent. It was not fear in his voice. It was clarity. He was doing exactly what he'd come to do: record, observe, report. He had entered the red zone to watch a volcano awaken and paid the highest price for knowledge. Peng Jiamu, 1980, Lop Nur, China. The wind never stops in Lop Nur. It drags walls of dust across the empty plain, blurring the horizon until the land and sky are the same colour. In the summer of 1980, a team of Chinese scientists set up camp on this lifeless ground, where the temperature could reach over 50 degrees Celsius by day and drop close to freezing at night. Among them was Peng Jiamu, a respected biochemist and explorer. He was 55 years old, known throughout China for his daring expeditions into deserts and salt flats that few people had ever crossed. Lop Nur was his latest challenge, a place so harsh that maps could barely agree on its boundaries. For centuries, the name Lop Nur had carried an aura of disappearance. Ancient caravans had vanished there, swallowed by shifting dunes and salt crusts that looked solid until they collapsed underfoot. In the 1950s, the region became even more forbidden. It was chosen as China's nuclear testing site. fenced off by hundreds of kilometres of unmarked desert. Official maps often left it blank. Even in 1980, the area was strictly controlled, accessible only by government-approved scientific missions. Peng's team had that rare permission. Their task was to survey the desert's geology and biological life, and to study mineral deposits on the dried lakebed. The expedition began smoothly. Peng was in good spirits, leading by example, walking the terrain, collecting samples, and keeping meticulous notes. He was known for pushing himself and others to go farther than planned. The scientists camped in tents and trucks, surrounded by nothing but sand and wind. They had limited water, rationed fuel, and little shade. Each morning they checked instruments, took temperature readings, and explored outward from their base. On June 17th, the sun rose blazing over the salt flats. The team had been without fresh water for some time. Their reserves were running low, and the map showed possible water sources several kilometres east. Peng told his colleagues he would walk in that direction to search. It was a simple decision, made without hesitation. He left behind his notebook, took a small canteen, a camera, and minimal gear. Before leaving, he wrote a short note on a piece of paper, heading east to look for water. Then he walked into the desert alone. Hours passed. By late afternoon, the others grew anxious. They scanned the horizon but saw nothing but waves of heat and blowing dust. When night fell, they lit fires as a signal. There was no response. The next day they searched on foot and by vehicle, calling his name into the wind. No tracks could be followed, the sand had already erased them. After 2 days, they radioed for help. Within days, a large search effort was underway. The Chinese Academy of Sciences dispatched aircraft, soldiers, and vehicles. For weeks, they scoured hundreds of square kilometres of salt plains and dunes. They found no footprints, no clothing, no canteen, no trace of the man who had walked away from camp. The desert gave nothing back. Over the years, more expeditions returned to look for him. In 1984, a team found scattered bones near a dry channel. They hoped it was him, but forensic analysis showed otherwise. In 2005, another set of skeletal remains was discovered near the same area. Once again, DNA testing ruled out any connection. The bones belonged to ancient travellers, not to Peng. Lopner's terrain makes disappearance easy. The ground is layered with thick crusts of salt that look firm but collapse under weight, revealing pockets of sand and brine below. Vehicles sink and vanish. A person walking alone could fall through and be buried within seconds. The wind constantly reshapes the dunes, burying what was visible one day and uncovering something else the next. Even a large object can vanish for decades beneath the surface. There are other possibilities. Some believe Peng may have wandered into one of the restricted military zones that surrounded the test fields. Lopner had been China's primary nuclear test site since the 1960s, and the region was full of sealed bunkers, underground tunnels, and monitoring stations. Rumours later surfaced that he might have strayed too close to a sensitive area and been detained or killed. No evidence ever surfaced to support that idea, but the secrecy of the site kept speculation alive. Others have suggested he might have lost direction and simply succumbed to the heat. In June, daytime temperatures easily reached levels where dehydration could kill within hours. With little shade, no landmarks, and no water, even an experienced explorer could die within a few kilometres of safety. His colleagues believed he would have pushed himself to continue forward rather than turn back. He was known for determination that sometimes bordered on stubbornness. Peng's disappearance shocked China's scientific community. He was a national figure, famous for his previous expeditions into the Taklamakan Desert and the Qaidam Basin. Newspapers called him a martyr of science. The government organised memorials and placed a stone monument in the desert with his name engraved on it. His family, including his wife and children, received official condolences but no answers. For years, the Academy of Sciences kept the search active whenever new reports emerged. None led to closure. The desert remained unchanged. In the decades that followed, travellers and researchers continued to report strange finds in Lop Nur. Abandoned vehicles, ancient human remains, traces of explorers who had died long before. Some said they saw the remains of Peng's camp still half buried in sand. None of these discoveries were confirmed. The location of his final steps remains uncertain. His story stands out because of where it happened. Lop Nur is not a normal wilderness. It is a place that sits at the intersection of science, secrecy, and danger. At the time Peng entered it, the region was still off limits to most civilians. His expedition worked under tight supervision, yet the desert's vastness made control impossible. To this day, parts of Lop Nur remain classified, with restricted access even to satellite mapping. It is possible that areas of interest to scientists then were also important to the military. The overlap between exploration and secrecy has made his disappearance a national mystery. In later interviews, surviving members of the team described their leader as calm and disciplined, never reckless. He was methodical, always noting his position and recording data. But in that final decision to look for water, something broke from routine. Perhaps he was confident he could handle a short walk alone, or perhaps he felt pressure to provide for his team. The direction he chose, east, led deeper into the harshest part of the desert. Every attempt to reconstruct his path runs into the same problem. The landscape itself moves. The dunes shift, the salt crust cracks, and the dry channels change direction with each sandstorm. Even with satellite images, no one can say exactly where he went. All that exists is the note he left behind, his confidence in finding water, and the silence that followed. Percy Fawcett, 1925, Amazon interior. The river was brown and heavy with rain when the expedition set out from the edge of Cuiabá, Brazil, in April 1925. The men loaded canoes with supplies: salted meat, machetes, guns, ropes, compasses, and notebooks. Percy Fawcett, a British explorer in his late 50s, checked every item himself. He was meticulous, quiet, and certain of what he was doing. For years he'd spoken of a lost city hidden deep within the Amazon, a place he called Zé. Many laughed at him. He believed ancient civilizations had once flourished there, long before Europeans arrived, and that traces of them still existed. This was his 8th expedition into South America, but it would be his last. He had served as a surveyor for the Royal Geographical Society, charting frontiers between Brazil and Bolivia. He knew jungle life better than most Europeans, but the expedition he was planning now was different. It was not official, it was personal. He wanted to find proof of Zé, a city he described as lying in an unexplored region between the Xingu and Tapajos rivers. He took with him his 22-year-old son Jack, and Jack's friend Raleigh Reimel. They would travel light and depend on local guides only in the early stages. The journey began smoothly. They paddled upriver through wetlands and forests, stopping at trading posts and indigenous villages. Fawcett sent letters home describing the expedition's progress. In one of the last, dated May 29th, he wrote that he felt confident about what lay ahead. "You need have no fear of any failure," he told his wife. That same day, the group reached a place he called Dead Horse Camp, named after a previous expedition's misfortune. From there, they entered unmapped territory. After that letter, no one heard from them again. Weeks later, when no further messages arrived, concern grew. Search parties were formed. The first were organised by local authorities, others were financed privately by newspapers and adventurers. They found abandoned camps, charred fires, and scattered objects, but nothing that proved what had happened. Fawcett and his companions had vanished into one of the densest jungles on Earth. The area they were exploring was known to be dangerous. The Xingu region was home to several indigenous groups who had little or no contact with outsiders. Some tribes were friendly, others defended their territory fiercely. Disease was also a threat. Malaria, yellow fever, and parasites could kill faster than hunger or weapons. The terrain itself could erase a person. The jungle closed behind them, swallowing trails within hours. Rain washed away footprints. Over the years, dozens of theories emerged. Some said they had been killed by hostile tribes. Others said they died of starvation or fever. There were rumours that Fawcett had found what he was looking for and decided never to return. Witnesses came forward, each with a different story. A trader claimed to have seen a white man living among indigenous people, wearing European clothes. An explorer who followed years later heard from villagers that 3 outsiders had passed through, one of them older, sick, and carried on a hammock. The stories conflicted in detail but shared the same ending. The outsiders never came back. The jungle was vast and every year it changed. Floods shifted river channels, trees grew over clearings, and entire paths vanished. Expeditions sent to find Fawcett often got lost themselves. By the 1930s, the mystery had become legend. Newspapers in Europe and America turned it into a story of obsession and disappearance. Some searchers died following his trail, others returned with artifacts they claimed were his, but none could be proven genuine. Fawcett had always been secretive about his maps. Before leaving, he refused to tell anyone his exact route, afraid that competitors would reach the city first. Even his sponsors at the Royal Geographical Society didn't have full details. That secrecy made the search nearly impossible. Every expedition that tried to retrace his path had to guess. Some followed the wrong rivers entirely. One of the few things known for certain came from an indigenous account collected years later. Members of the Kalapalo tribe told of 3 outsiders who passed near their territory in 1925. The strangers camped near a river, lit fires, and then walked east. The tribe's elders said they later heard distant gunshots, then silence. In their version, the men were likely killed by another group deeper in the forest. That account matched roughly the direction Fawcett's party was believed to have taken, but no evidence was ever found. The British government eventually declared Fawcett and his team dead. Official reports listed them as missing, presumed killed in the jungle. His wife never accepted it. She continued to believe he had found the city and chosen to stay there. For decades she kept his notebooks and maps locked away. Even after her death, the mystery remained. As time passed, explorers continued to search for the truth. Some claimed to find bones that might belong to the missing men. Scientists examined them, but results were inconclusive. Others said they found pieces of equipment, yet none could be linked directly to the expedition. Each discovery reignited the story and drew new people into the jungle. By the late 20th century, more than 100 explorers had gone missing themselves while searching for traces of Fawcett. Modern archaeology has since uncovered evidence that Fawcett was not entirely wrong. Satellite images and ground surveys have revealed ancient earthworks, road systems, and geometric shapes hidden beneath the canopy, proof that large organised societies once lived in regions once thought empty. But none of these discoveries have connected directly to him. His disappearance remains as open as the day it happened. The trail of his journey, as reconstructed from his letters and maps, stretches through a region that is still among the least explored on the continent. The coordinates of Dead Horse Camp place it near the upper Xingu, but from there the path dissolves into hundreds of miles of forest and river. The point where his last fire was lit has never been identified. Those who met him before he left described Fawcett as calm, lean, and intensely driven. He spoke of the jungle not as a threat, but as a test. "The forest is alive," he told a friend. "It watches, it knows." That sense of reverence may have guided him, but it also may have blinded him to the danger. His companions followed him with complete trust, their faith carried by youth and admiration. Ludwig Leichhardt, 1848, Australian interior. The morning of April 3rd, 1848 began like so many others on the Darling Downs, in southern Queensland. A few scattered remnant farms, cattle grazing in the open land, and the vast interior of Australia rolling inland where European settlers rarely went. For Ludwig Leichhardt, a 35-year-old Prussian naturalist and explorer, this moment marked the launch of a daring mission to cross the continent from east to west, targeting the Swan River settlement on the far coast of Western Australia. He and his party stepped beyond the edge of mapped lands into what many at the time considered the forbidden interior. Leichhardt had already achieved a remarkable feat. His first major expedition from Moreton Bay to Port Essington between 1844 and 1845 had proven that Australia's interior could be traversed. That success gave him boldness and ambition. In 1848 he organised another expedition. 5 European companions, 2 Aboriginal guides, 7 horses, 20 mules and 50 bullocks. The supplies were substantial, the goal enormous. Cross the continent, chart new lands, collect specimens of flora and fauna, and claim scientific glory. They left from the Condamine River region, moved toward Cogoon Station, sometimes spelled Coogan, on the Darling Downs, where the last European sighting of the party was recorded. At Cogoon Station, station owner Alan McPherson and his workers watched the small caravan of animals and men head inland. Leichhardt reputedly said simply, "To the setting sun." Then the party vanished. No notes beyond that point, no letters, no sightings. The map shows the outgoing route, Darling Downs, heading westward into unknown terrain. But beyond that, the records stop. The maproom chase therefore begins with Leichhardt's known departure point, then follows the uncharted land. Centre West Queensland, the Great Sandy Desert, the Gibson Desert, the margins of Western Australia. The terrain they entered was harsh. Arid scrub, shifting sand, water sources rare, trails unmarked, indigenous lands remote and hostile to strangers. the expedition had to navigate without detailed maps, without guaranteed supply lines, and with animals that could perish. The ledger of evidence offers entries. Entry 1, departure on the 3rd of April, last official sighting at Kagoon Station. Entry 2, discovery years later of trees marked with the initials L or LL in far western regions, and a brass plate marked Ludwig Leichhardt 1848, attached to a burnt shotgun in a boab tree near Sturt Creek. Entry 3, search expeditions launched in 1855 and again in 1864 found no conclusive remains, only more trees bearing cryptic initials. Entry 4, Aboriginal oral traditions recorded decades later told of whites travelling with bullocks who were killed, but no names or proof tied to Leichhardt. Entry 5, the question of terrain. The map shows they would have to cross the continent's driest heart, where water is scarce, heat intense, paths non-existent. Now the cold case dossier. What do we know, what don't we, and what lines of inquiry remain? We know Leichhardt's party disappeared. No body, no journal, no confirmed artefact linked to them, beyond the occasional contested find. The map traces where they began, but not where they ended. The missing elements are many. Did they die of thirst? Did they fall victim to conflict with indigenous groups? Did animals perish, and the party give up and vanish into assimilation? Did they simply drift off route into the desert and perish without trace? Possible scenarios: 1. They succumbed to natural hardship, the lack of water, the hostile climate, the animals failing, the party weakened. In that scenario, they died or dispersed, leaving no trace. 2. They met with hostile contact. Some Aboriginal groups fiercely defended land and resources. Evidence in tradition suggests attacks on outsider parties. That could explain abrupt disappearance. 3. They attempted an alternate route, became lost, and either perished in isolation or merged with indigenous groups. Each scenario has flaws. No remains, no artifacts confirmed, no coherent chain of custody, yet all remain plausible. The map context is vital. The continent's interior in 1848 logistically uncharted, water holes unreliable, supplies heavy, animals cannot carry indefinitely, indigenous groups unfamiliar with European explorers. The ledger records the last known camp, the marked trees, the brass plate find, the search parties, but the evidence is scattered and contested. Several search expeditions over decades looked for the trail. One found the brass plate near Sturt Creek in the Kimberley area, but it could not be conclusively tied to the original party. Another found trees marked with L in far north Queensland, but those could also be old landmarks. In 2019, a former racing driver turned explorer, Larry Perkins, claimed to have found burnt objects near Sturt Creek and a plate, but said the track was unclear and the evidence insufficient, so the case remains unresolved. Leichhardt's disappearance has become the greatest mystery of Australian exploration. The map-room chase goes from Darling Downs to the continent's centre and finally into the unknown. The witness patchwork, the trees, the oral accounts, the brass plate, offers fragments but no picture. Leichhardt's ambition was scientific: natural history, specimens, mapping land for agriculture, science for the colony's benefit. Yet, that ambition may have led him into a zone the settlers feared. Interior country with limited water and unknown cultures. He believed in crossing the continent and opening it up. But he underestimated the risks. He and his companions, 2 Aboriginal guides and others, entered a landscape that defied European logistics and endurance. Turning to the ledger one more time, we note that after 1848 the government offered rewards for information, sponsored searches, but never closed the case. Officially, the expedition is missing and presumed dead. The brass plate find in 1990 near Sturt Creek is the most concrete artefact, but still lacks chain of evidence. Aboriginal oral history states there were whites with cattle west of the Darling Downs taken by tribes, but the dating and names don't align confidently. Modern analysis holds that main likely death zone is the Great Sandy Desert or Gibson Desert region, according to terrain and likely route. Despite modern satellite imaging and archaeological survey, no trace of campsites or artefacts has been reliably tied to Leichhardt. The map still shows the route he might have taken but cannot show his endpoint. The dossier remains open. Did Leichhardt and his party blaze a path across Australia, or simply vanish in the wilderness? The answer remains hidden in the domain of sand, scrub, and myth. Vladimir Rusanov, 1912, Novaya Zemlya, Arctic. The Arctic has a way of swallowing sound. Wind moves across the ice, waves crash against pack floes, and then silence falls, so complete that even the sea seems to stop breathing. In the summer of 1912, a small Russian expedition sailed into that silence. Their leader was Vladimir Alexandrovich Rusanov, a 33-year-old geologist and Arctic explorer. He had studied at the Sorbonne in Paris, returned to Russia full of ambition, and dedicated himself to mapping the most remote northern coasts of the empire. His goal that year was to survey the mineral-rich islands of Novaya Zemlya, a frozen archipelago stretching like a broken spine between the Barents and Kara seas. The expedition began as a scientific mission. It ended in one of the Arctic's great disappearances. Rusanov's ship was called Hercules. It was a small wooden vessel barely 24 meters long, with a coal-fired engine and sails for backup. The crew consisted of 11 men, most of them Russian sailors with limited Arctic experience, and one French woman, Juliette Jean, who had joined as a scientist and Rusanov's companion. They left Alexandrovsk on Murmel, near present-day Murmansk, in June 1912. At first, the journey went well. They surveyed the coastlines, collected geological samples, and documented wildlife along the western shore of Novaya Zemlya. Rusanov sent reports back to the Russian Academy of Sciences, describing valuable coal seams and promising mineral deposits. His letters spoke with enthusiasm and confidence. He planned to return before the autumn storm set in. But as the Arctic summer waned, Rusanov's plans changed. He decided not to sail back to Murmansk as scheduled. Instead, he told his crew they would attempt a daring passage eastward through the Kara Sea, toward the mouth of the Yenisei River, and eventually Siberia. It was an uncharted route for such a small vessel, blocked by shifting ice and poorly mapped shoals. His colleagues in St. Petersburg had not authorized this extension of the mission. The Hercules had limited coal reserves, no wireless radio, and provisions for only a few months. But Rusanov believed the ice conditions that year were unusually light. He was certain he could make it. In late August, whalers in the Kara Sea saw a small vessel moving east between drifting ice. They later identified it as the Hercules. The ship appeared to be in good condition, flying a Russian flag. That sighting was the last confirmed trace of Vladimir Rusanov and his crew. After that, the Arctic closed behind them. Winter came early that year. By mid-September, the Kara Sea was already freezing. Strong winds pushed ice floes toward the coast of Siberia, trapping ships and crushing hulls. The Hercules was small enough to be caught and splintered without a trace. But no wreckage was found that season or the next. For years afterward, search parties tried to find evidence of what had happened. In 1913, when Rusanov failed to return, the Russian government launched an investigation. None of the expedition's members had sent word, and their names did not appear in any harbour logs. The Arctic Ocean remained silent. In 1914, fragments began to appear. A few wooden objects, including parts of a ship's mast and pieces of barrels marked with Russian writing, were found on the eastern shore of Novaya Zemlya. None could be conclusively tied to the Hercules, but they kept the mystery alive. The most important discoveries came years later. In 1914 and 1915, several small expeditions reached the Taimyr Peninsula, hundreds of kilometers east of where Rusanov had last been seen. There, they found traces of human presence. Camp remains, fragments of clothing, a rifle, and a wooden box marked with the initials VR. Inside the box were documents damaged by water and ice, but one page contained notes in Rusanov's handwriting. It described an icebound ship and an attempt to reach land on foot. The writing broke off mid-sentence. That single piece of paper became the central entry in the evidence ledger. The handwriting matched samples from earlier expeditions. The notes suggested that the Hercules had been trapped in ice somewhere between the Kara Sea and the mouth of the Pyasina River. The crew had likely abandoned the ship and tried to trek across the frozen coast towards safety. It was a decision many Arctic explorers before them had made, and few survived. Years passed. The First World War began, then the Russian Revolution. Search efforts stopped. Only in the 1920s did explorers once again reach the region, this time using reindeer and sleds. They found more remains, tools, rifle cartridges, pieces of a lifeboat, and a fragment of a ship's log. The entries were brief, describing ice pressure and dwindling supplies. The last line read simply, "The frost is strong." Rusanov's disappearance became one of the most haunting Arctic mysteries of the early 20th century. His fate mirrored that of many explorers who underestimated the power of the ice. Yet his expedition was unusual for its combination of science and personal passion. He was not just a geologist seeking minerals, he was a man driven by a sense of discovery, believing that the Arctic held both natural wealth and national pride for Russia. The inclusion of Juliette Jean added another layer to the story. She was educated, fluent in several languages, and trained in chemistry. Her decision to join a small ship into one of the world's most dangerous seas shocked many. Her fate, like Rusanov's, remains unknown. The search for traces of the Gherkins continued intermittently for decades. In 1934, Soviet scientists on an Arctic expedition found more scattered artifacts along the coast of the Taimyr Peninsula, rusted metal, buttons, and fragments of a sextant. None proved decisive, but they strengthened the idea that Rusanov's crew had indeed reached the mainland before succumbing to the elements. The positions of those finds were plotted on maps, forming a faint trail from the Kara Sea toward the interior of Siberia. The distances involved were immense, over 800 kilometers of frozen wasteland. No wreck of the Gherkins has ever been located. The seafloor of the Kara Sea remains shallow but constantly shifting, with sediment and ice movement that bury objects quickly. Modern surveys using sonar have found many wrecks from later eras, but none matching the size or shape of Rusanov's vessel. If it still exists, it likely lies beneath layers of mud and ice, preserved in the cold. In the years following his disappearance, Rusanov became both a hero and a warning. The Soviet government later honoured him as a pioneer of Arctic exploration. Towns, ships, and geological stations were named after him. Yet the details of his final journey remain fragmentary. Letters, notes, a few objects, and the last sighting of a small ship heading east into the fog. What can be pieced together suggests a final sequence. The Gherkins trapped in ice late in the season, the hull crushed or immobilised, the crew abandoning ship with sledges and limited supplies, moving toward the mainland. At least some of them reached land, leaving traces that would be found years later. But no record shows that any survived the journey inland. The Arctic gives no graves. Andree's balloon expedition, 1897 High Arctic. In the summer of 1897, a balloon stood tethered on the edge of the Arctic Ocean, its silk envelope shimmering pale gold under a midnight sun. The air smelled of oil, rope, and salt. 3 men worked around it with quiet determination. Their leader was Salomon August Andree, a Swedish engineer and scientist. He had spent years planning this moment, the first attempt to reach the North Pole by air. His belief was simple. Where ships failed, a hydrogen balloon could succeed. The polar ice had defeated every expedition that tried to cross it by sea, but Andree believed wind could do what muscle could not. He called his balloon Ornen, the Eagle. It was 20 meters tall and filled with thousands of cubic meters of hydrogen. The plan was to launch from Donskoye, a small island north of Spitsbergen, and drift with the polar winds toward the pole and then across to Alaska or Russia. Andree had secured funding from the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences and even from King Oscar II himself. Newspapers across Europe followed every detail of the preparations. The balloon's gondola carried food, cameras, instruments, and homing pigeons trained to carry messages back. On July 11, 1897, after days of waiting for favourable winds, the ropes were cut. The Eagle rose slowly into the sky, the men waving to those on the ground. Alongside Andree were Niels Strindberg, a young physicist and photographer, and Knut Frankel, an engineer who had joined at the last minute to replace a sick crew member. For a few minutes the balloon drifted smoothly, heading northeast. Onlookers watched until it became a small dot over the frozen sea. Then it disappeared into the mist. That was the last anyone saw of them for 33 years. Andree had promised to drop message buoys along the way. 2 were later found, bobbing in the ice, carrying short notes. The first, dated the day of the launch, reported that all was well. The second, found on an ice floe months later, was brief. All going well so far. After that, silence. The balloon, the men, and their equipment vanished into the Arctic fog. For decades, theories multiplied. Some said the balloon had crashed almost immediately after takeoff. Others believed they had reached the North Pole and perished on the return. A few claimed to have seen smoke from their campfires on distant ice. No proof came. The Arctic gave nothing back. The maproom chase begins with the known trajectory of the wind that day. Meteorologists later calculated that the prevailing currents would have carried the balloon northeast, across the pack ice toward the polar basin. But the balloon was not stable. Almost immediately after launch, it began to lose hydrogen through its seams. Ice formed on the ropes. Condensation added weight. When the ropes dipped into the sea, they froze solid. Within 2 days, the Eagle was out of control, rising and falling with every gust. At some point, the balloon touched down on the ice and dragged across the surface like a wounded animal. The men were forced to cut loose ballast, supplies, and even some scientific instruments to stay afloat. By July 14th, only 3 days after launch, they made a hard landing on an ice field. The balloon collapsed behind them. They were now stranded in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, hundreds of kilometers from land, with no ship, no communication, and limited supplies. Andree's notebooks, found decades later, described what happened next. The 3 men salvaged what they could: tents, rifles, food, cameras, and notebooks. They began walking south, pulling sledges over the ice. Their goal was to reach Franz Josef Land or Spitsbergen, whichever they could find first. The ice drifted constantly, making navigation almost impossible. They slept in a single tent, recorded temperatures, and shot polar bears for food. They built a hut from driftwood and snow. They burned blubber for light. Through the diary entries, their journey can be traced like a fading heartbeat. On July 22nd, Andree wrote, "We now march toward home." By August, exhaustion set in. The ice cracked beneath them, forcing them to rebuild their camp repeatedly. Polar bears prowled nearby at night. They dragged sledges over ridges of ice that rose like frozen waves. When the ice shifted, they were thrown into water and had to pull themselves out, soaking and freezing. On August 4th, the diary notes show a brief glimpse of hope. They sighted land. It was White Island, part of the Svalbard archipelago. They reached it after weeks of drifting, but the island offered little shelter, just rock, snow, and the endless sea. They established a final camp there, known now as Kvitoya. The last diary entry, written by Andree himself, is dated October 17, 1897. It reads, "The snow is beginning to drift. We shall now rest." After that line, nothing. For more than 3 decades, the camp remained frozen and untouched. The Arctic winter covered it each year, burying everything under ice. Then, in 1930, a Norwegian expedition landed on White Island by chance. As they explored the shoreline, they found wooden boxes, tools, and bones. Further inland, they discovered a collapsed tent with the remains of 3 men. Nearby lay cameras, journals, rifles, and cooking gear, perfectly preserved in the cold. The carving on one box read Andree's Expedition 1897. When the diaries were examined, the story of their final months emerged. The balloon had failed within 2 days. They had survived nearly 3 months on drifting ice before reaching land. Their last camp had been crushed by an advancing glacier. The cause of death was likely exhaustion, exposure, or possibly food poisoning from eating polar bear meat contaminated with trichinosis. The film from Strindberg's camera was developed, showing haunting images: the balloon over the ice, men pulling sledges, tents under grey skies, and one photograph believed to show their final camp. The discovery caused a sensation worldwide. Newspapers printed the recovered photographs. Scientists pored over Andree's meticulous notes. The wreckage was brought back to Sweden, where thousands gathered to see it. The journals revealed a calm, methodical effort to survive, measuring, recording, calculating, even as death closed in. The evidence ledger of the case contains those artifacts: the diaries, the photographs, the bones, and the remnants of the Eagle. Together they tell a story that had been lost under the ice for 33 years. The map of their route, reconstructed from wind data and the coordinates in Andree's notes, shows a short, doomed arc across the top of the world, less than 500 kilometers from launch to final camp. Their final position on White Island is marked today by a small memorial. The objects recovered from the site rest in museums in Stockholm. Notebooks, boots, fragments of the balloon's silk, and the rusted cooking pot that once held melted snow. Each piece sits frozen in time as if waiting for the wind to return. Vittorio Bottego, 1897, Horn of Africa. The rivers of East Africa move like lines drawn through dust. Deep, brown, and slow. In the late 19th century, these were lands few Europeans had mapped, places marked on charts only by rumour and the uncertain paths of caravans. Into this world rode Vittorio Bottego, an Italian army officer turned explorer and naturalist. He was tall, restless, and driven by an almost scientific stubbornness. His mission was to map the last unknown stretches of the Horn of Africa, to trace rivers that Western geography still drew as dotted lines, and to collect zoological specimens for the museums of Italy. He would become the first European to follow the Omo River to its end. But in 1897, his second expedition crossed into hostile territory and vanished. Bottego's first journey, from 1892 to 1893, had made him famous. He had mapped the upper Juba River and parts of what is now Somalia, returning to Italy with valuable data and rare animal specimens. The Italian government and the Geographical Society of Florence hailed him as a national hero. He returned to Africa in 1895 with new funding and grander ambitions. His second expedition was meant to link the sources of the Omo, Wabe and Dawa rivers and then push westward toward the Upper Nile, a route few outsiders had ever attempted. By then, the region was far from stable. The Ethiopian Empire under Emperor Menelik II was expanding, consolidating power after its victory over Italy at Adwa that same year. Many areas Bottego intended to cross were under Menelik's authority or fiercely defended by local chiefs. Still, he pressed on. The Italian government distanced itself from him, unwilling to risk new conflict so soon after military defeat, but Bottego continued independently, leading a party of 30 men, Italian officers, Somali porters, and local guides. They set off from the Gulf of Aden in late 1895, marching inland toward the highlands. Over the next 2 years, they fought their way through harsh terrain, arid plains, disease-ridden valleys, and rivers that cut deep gorges through black basalt. Bottego was both explorer and collector, shooting game for museums and describing new species of antelope and birds. His notebooks were filled with precise notes on topography and tribal customs. He kept meticulous records, even as his supplies ran low and his relations with locals grew tense. By late 1896, the expedition reached the Omo River. It was the heart of his ambition. For months they followed its course southward, enduring heat, hunger and illness. At times they were reduced to eating their pack animals. Still, they continued mapping every bend and tributary, marking villages, waterfalls and rapids. It was work done under constant risk of attack. Bottego's men were often surrounded by hostile groups. He avoided confrontation when possible, but he also carried rifles and used them when threatened. The last confirmed part of his journey took him westward, toward Lake Turkana, then known as Lake Rudolph. It was a borderland between Ethiopian-controlled territory and regions the British considered their sphere of influence. Neither power wanted Europeans moving freely there. On March 17, 1897, somewhere near the Dawa and Ganale rivers, Bottego's group encountered warriors from the Oromo people. Accounts differ on what happened next. According to the earliest reports from survivors, a misunderstanding sparked violence. The expedition had approached a settlement seeking food and rest. The villagers, fearing attack, armed themselves. Bottego tried to negotiate but was struck by a spear. Fighting broke out and several of his men were killed. The survivors scattered into the wilderness. Some were captured and later released by Ethiopian forces. They reported that Bottego had been killed in the skirmish, but his body was never found. Other accounts, told later by local witnesses and Ethiopian soldiers, claimed he was wounded, captured alive, and executed by order of an Ethiopian commander named Ras Tessema. Those stories say his body was buried in an unmarked grave near the Dawa River. No one ever confirmed the location. When news of his disappearance reached Italy, it caused both outrage and fascination. The country was still reeling from the defeat at Adwa, and the loss of its most famous explorer deepened the national humiliation. Newspapers published conflicting reports. Some said he had been murdered, others that he was alive in captivity. The Italian government sent inquiries to Addis Ababa, but relations with Ethiopia were strained. Emperor Menelik denied any involvement and said he had no knowledge of the incident. Months later, a few of Bottego's surviving companions reached the coast. Their stories were confused, shaped by exhaustion and fear. They spoke of long marches through desert and swamp, of starvation and disease, of hearing gunfire and then silence. Some said Bottego fell instantly in battle. Others believed he had been taken prisoner and killed days later. None could identify exactly where the confrontation had happened. The maps they brought back ended abruptly near the Dawa River, marked only by a single word: dispersed. That word became the last entry in his expedition's record. Years passed before anyone tried to retrace his route. In 1901, the explorer Prince Eugenio Ruspoli organised a search, hoping to locate Bottego's remains. He reached the Omo region but found only rumours. Villagers who remembered a group of Europeans, the story of a fight, a grave lost to floods. Later, in 1902, Captain Carlo Citerni followed part of the same route. He confirmed some of Bottego's earlier mapping but found no trace of the missing expedition. The evidence ledger remains sparse. The expedition's last letters, survivor testimony, and scattered local accounts. No physical remains were ever identified. No artifacts, no rifles, no notebooks, no personal effects were recovered. Only one of his sketches, mailed earlier to Italy, survived as proof of his final journey. The witness patchwork from Ethiopian sources adds complexity. Some local elders later told Italian visitors that Bottego had refused to surrender his rifle and was killed on the spot. Others claimed he was executed after capture for crossing into restricted lands. There were even stories that his body had been placed in the river as a warning to outsiders. Without a grave or reliable record, all remain fragments of oral memory. In Italy, Bottego's disappearance took on symbolic weight. Streets and schools were named after him. Museums displayed the animals and fossils he'd collected. The few surviving members of his expedition published accounts that mixed admiration with guilt. They remembered him as fearless, sometimes reckless, but always curious. His notebooks, those that reached home, show a man fascinated not only by geography, but by the people and languages he encountered. He wrote with precision about wildlife, rainfall, and even local proverbs. His tone rarely showed fear, only frustration at delays. The cold case dossier, even now, contains only uncertain possibilities. His death date is recorded as March 17, 1897, based on survivors' testimony. The place, somewhere between the Dawa and Ganale rivers, near today's border between Ethiopia and Kenya. The cause? Conflict with local tribes, exact circumstances unknown. His remains never recovered. More than a century later, the route he followed can be traced by modern maps. Many of the regions he crossed are still isolated, still dry and harsh. The river valleys he surveyed remain vital landmarks in East African geography, but the exact location of the encounter that ended his expedition is still unmarked, somewhere in the scrub and thorn of southern Ethiopia. Dennis Tingbell, 1959, Antarctica. A cold dawn light glinted off the ice of King George Island in July 1959 as young British meteorologist Dennis Tingbell stepped out from the research hut at Admiralty Bay. At 25 years old, he was months into a 2-year assignment with the Falkland Islands Dependencies Survey, adding to the early era's efforts to map the Antarctic climate. He joined a small team of scientists, dog sleds and equipment, ready to tackle the challenges of the polar plateau. That morning they prepared to ascend the Ecology Glacier, surveying ice flows and rock samples. On July 26th, Bell and surveyor Jeff Stokes led the dogs and sledges ahead of the others. As they climbed, the dogs flagged, the snow deepened and the glacier crevassed. Bell left his skis behind to encourage the team and walked ahead across a snow bridge that concealed a yawning crevasse. Without warning, he vanished into the ice beneath him. That moment marks the break of routine, the entry into the breach of safety in a zone scientists had deemed manageable. The glacier seemed stable, but the soft snow and hidden voids betrayed them. Stokes called to Bell. He heard an answer. Stokes lowered a rope about 30 metres. Bell used his belt to tie to the rope. The dogs were hitched and began to pull him upward. All seemed under control until the belt snapped at the lip of the crevasse and Bell fell back into darkness. From that moment, no voice answered. Stokes shouted. There was only silence. The storm worsened. The search had to be abandoned. No body, no gear, no farewell. Bell remained missing. The ledger of facts begins with the stationing. Bell had arrived at Admiralty Bay in 1958, trained as a meteorologist at Harrow, served with the RAF and had accepted the Antarctic posting willingly. On July 26, 1959, the survey party climbed the glacier. The dogs were tired, snow was deep. Bell went without skis to push ahead. The snow bridge collapsed, rescue rope used, belt failed, the fall followed, no trace found. The region is marked on the map as Antarctica's South Shetland Islands, Ecology Glacier on King George Island, an outpost of research and ice. Years passed. The glacier moved. The ice advanced, retreated, cracked, and concealed secrets within. The field notebooks recorded the event, the date, the names, the failed rescue. The official log reads, "Missing presumed dead," but the body was never recovered. For decades, the mystery sat in a red zone of ice, a place that seemed scientific, mapped, monitored, but still wild beyond full control. The cold zone had swallowed a man. In January 2025, a breakthrough occurred. A team from the Henryk Arctowski Polish Antarctic Station discovered human remains exposed at the front of Ecology Glacier, rocks and ice revealed by the glacier's retreat. Near the bones lay over 200 personal items: radio equipment, ski poles, an inscribed wristwatch, a Swedish Mora knife, a pipe stem. DNA tests at King's College London matched the remains to Bell's brother and sister. The ledger closed one entry, remains found after 66 years. The map now shows a dot-marked discovery site January 19, 2025 on the glacier's edge. The frozen zone had given up its secret. The maproom chase runs from the base at Admiralty Bay up the glacier, across icefields crevassed and shifting to the site of Bell's disappearance. Then, decades later, the glacier front where his remains surfaced, an arc that traces both the accident and the inexorable movement of ice. The terrain turned on him. The mountain, the glacier, the shifting snow. What he walked across is now the very path by which his story re-emerged. In the ledger we mark key coordinates: the base, the glacier's traverse, the crevasse zone, and the final finding site. The missing pieces in the dossier keep the questions alive. Had he succumbed instantly to the fall? Did he survive briefly in the crevasse before dying of exposure? Where was the dog sled team when the ice failed? Why did his belt break? The conditions were brutal. July in Antarctica still means freezing, with wind ripping off surfaces, crevasse bridges hidden by snow, fatigue from sled dogs, and the remote location making rescue impossible. The zone was monitored for science, but not immune to nature. Personal items recovered added emotional weight to the ledger. Bell's wristwatch inscribed, his radio gear, ski poles, a pipe, all items that anchored him to the place. These items lay on the exposed moraine at the glacier's edge. They told a story of time, ice movement, and memory. For decades they lay beneath ice. The glacier advanced, carried him forward, then retreated to reveal him. This is evidence, physical and aerial, linking man, machine, ice, and time. In the field of Antarctic science, his disappearance and rediscovery live as a caution tale. The red zone of glacier ecology, despite maps, despite monitoring, still killed a scientist. Now, the map room shows his path and the site too, but those years of missing data, missing body, missing closure remain part of the dossier. His family asked, why him? Why there? The science base at Admiralty Bay had protocols for meteorology, sled work, crevasse zones, but still one man was lost. The evidence ledger records last known contact. Bell's voice answered once after the fall. Rescue attempted, weather closed in. Other team members evacuated, log ends, no body. Memory lingers. The maproom chase reconstructs the route, the crevasse site, the retreating glacier that later revealed the remains. Cold case dossier, remains found, DNA matched, artifacts recovered, closure partial, questions remain about the moment of failure and the missing period between fall and discovery. Conrad Stefan, 2020 Greenland ice sheet. The wind over Greenland never stops. It carries fine ice dust that settles into everything. Tents, instruments, even the folds of a notebook. On August 8, 2020, Conrad Stefan, one of the world's leading glaciologists, stepped out onto that frozen expanse for what was supposed to be a routine day of research. He had spent decades here, studying how fast the Greenland ice sheet was melting. His camp, a cluster of white shelters and weather towers known as Swiss Camp, sat about 80 kilometers inland from the coast, near the Jakobshavn Glacier. It was a place he knew better than anywhere else on Earth. The people who worked with him used to say that the ice was his second home. That morning, Stefan was checking data stations around the camp. Metal towers wired with instruments that recorded temperature, wind, and melt rates. He had designed and built most of them himself. The ice beneath Swiss Camp had changed drastically over the years. When he first established it in 1990, it sat on firm snowpack nearly 10 metres above the surface meltline. By 2020, warming had eaten away at the foundation. The camp now stood on an uneven field of slush, cracks and hidden meltwater channels. The weather that day was typical for an Arctic summer: bright sun, light wind, temperatures just above freezing. Stefan left camp on a short trip to inspect one of the nearby stations. He was alone, but planned to return within an hour. He never came back. When colleagues realised he was overdue, they began searching along the marked paths between the camp's instruments. They found footprints leading toward a depression where meltwater pooled. The surface looked deceptively stable, but it hid a crevasse, one of the deep fractures that form when the ice sheet moves and melts from below. Around its edges, they found his ski poles and one of his gloves. The hole dropped vertically, filled with cold blue water that disappeared into darkness. The rescuers called out his name, but there was no sound below. The map of that moment is small but stark. One line from the main tent, 300 metres northeast toward the nearest weather mast. Another line ending at a crevasse roughly 1 metre wide and impossible to see until you were on top of it. The map room chase, in this case, is measured in steps, not kilometres, each one marking a place he had walked countless times before. The glacier's surface that year was more dangerous than usual. Record high temperatures had turned much of the ice into slush. Hidden melt channels opened and closed overnight. Even experienced researchers could misjudge the ground's stability. For Stefan, who had logged more than 30 consecutive summers here, familiarity may have been its own trap. He knew the terrain so well that he worked without a harness or rope. The crevasse he fell into may have opened only hours earlier. The evidence ledger begins with the time, approximately 11 a.m. local. Stefan leaves camp carrying a notebook, 2 poles and a GPS receiver. By 12:30 p.m, when he failed to return, colleagues began searching. By 1 p.m, they found the crevasse. They secured ropes and lights, but the opening was too narrow and unstable to enter safely. Meltwater was flowing fast, pulling debris and ice chunks downward. Helicopters from nearby Ilulissat were called, but deteriorating weather and the risk of collapse forced the team to halt the attempt. Over the following days, additional efforts were made with specialised cameras and drones. None reached far enough to locate a body. The water in the crevasse led into a subglacial drainage system, a labyrinth of tunnels that carried meltwater toward the sea. Within hours, the current would have swept anything inside deep into the ice. The official search ended on August 11th. The glacier, moving roughly a metre a day, would continue to shift and bury whatever lay within. Stefan had spent his entire career studying how such melt channels formed. He had warned governments and climate conferences that Greenland's ice was disappearing faster than models predicted. His work combined field observation, satellite data, and decades of personal measurement. Every pole and sensor at Swiss camp was part of that story, tracking how heat turned solid ice into rivers. His last moments were on that same melting surface, walking across data he'd spent his life collecting. The camp itself had been his creation. He first built it in 1990, hauling gear by snowmobile and helicopter. It became one of the longest-running climate observation sites in the Arctic. Over the years, he returned each summer bringing students, colleagues, and journalists. He would point to the horizon and say, "You can see climate change here." In the 1990s, the camp stood on hard snow. By 2010, the ground had sunk into pools of meltwater. He once joked that one day the camp might float away. The cold case dossier that followed his disappearance is painfully brief. Witnesses, his research team stationed at Swiss camp. Location 69.55 degrees, N 49.38 degrees W. Last sighting, walking east from camp. Recovered items, ski poles, glove, notebook fragment. Body not recovered. Cause of death, accidental fall into crevasse. Time of death estimated between 11:15 and 11:45 a.m, August 8, 2020. Within scientific circles, his loss was felt immediately. He had been director of the Swiss Federal Institute for Forest, Snow and Landscape Research and a professor at ETH Zurich. He was one of the most prominent experts on polar ice dynamics. For many who knew him, the irony was devastating, that a man who had dedicated his life to studying melting ice would be taken by it. Satellite images from the following weeks showed the crevasse widening and closing again as surface melt refroze. By winter, Snow had buried all traces of the accident. Swiss Camp continued operating autonomously through its instruments, transmitting data by satellite, temperatures, wind speed, ice movement, numbers that flowed steadily while the man who built them remained trapped somewhere beneath. In the years since, the glacier has continued to retreat. The site where he fell now lies several meters lower, part of a widening meltwater network feeding into Jakobshavn Glacier's main channel. The instruments still record the same data he came to collect: air temperature, surface melt, ice flow velocity. Each number adds to a record he began 30 years earlier. His final measurements were likely logged automatically that day, even as the ice beneath him gave way. The map of his life's work stretches far beyond Greenland. Stefan led studies in the Arctic, Antarctic, and Alaska. His research helped shape global understanding of how melting ice contributes to sea level rise. But Greenland was always central. He called Swiss Camp his home in the climate system. Every summer he returned, often with former students who would later continue his work. The witness patchwork from that final day includes the voices of his team. They describe him stepping outside, cheerful, moving quickly between the tents, saying he would check the sensors before lunch. No distress call came over the radio. The silence afterward was immediate. They followed his tracks until they stopped at the hole in the ice. The crevasse was narrow, no more than a meter wide, but seemed bottomless. The sound of running water echoed faintly from below. Ricardo Poton, 2025, Mendenhall Glacier, Alaska. The ice tunnels of Alaska's Mendenhall Glacier are like cathedrals, arched ceilings of deep blue light, smooth walls carved by meltwater, and a sound that never stops. On July 2nd, 2025, that sound drowned out the last words of an Italian scientist who had come to study them. His name was Ricardo Poton, a planetary geologist from the University of Padua. He specialized in comparing the landscapes of Earth and Mars, searching for the physical clues that link glaciers, volcanoes, and extraterrestrial ice. He had worked in Iceland, Chile, and Antarctica. This trip to Alaska was part of a National Geographic-funded project on how meltwater tunnels, known as moulins, could help scientists understand similar structures in Martian ice caps. That morning, the team gathered near the glacier's entrance. It was a clear day, unusually warm for early July. The air temperature hovered around 22 degrees Celsius, accelerating the melt. Streams of water ran over the surface of the glacier, converging into larger flows that vanished down narrow shafts. These moulins are vertical chasms that plunge hundreds of feet into the ice, draining surface water into the glacier's interior. To glaciologists, they are both beautiful and deadly. Poton and two colleagues were measuring melt rates and mapping surface flows with drones and sensors. He was equipped with safety gear, a GPS unit, and a camera. Around midday, he walked toward a stream channeling into a moulin to collect samples. Witnesses said he stepped close to the edge, using a probe to measure the flow's velocity. The ice beneath him suddenly fractured. A section collapsed and he fell into the torrent. His colleagues saw him disappear within seconds. The current pulled him straight down into the moulin, into the glacier itself. The place where it happened is marked now by coordinates near the glacier's lower face, above Mendenhall Lake. The moulin was roughly 0.8 meters wide at the top, widening into a vertical shaft carved smooth by centuries of meltwater. The noise of the water was so loud that shouts were swallowed instantly. The team rushed to the edge, peering down into the spinning blue funnel. They could see nothing but the blur of water and ice. The breach and red zone structure fits this case almost too perfectly. The breach, a scientist stepping into the boundary between observation and danger. The red zone, the place where nature turned scientific curiosity into catastrophe. Poton had studied planetary surfaces shaped by ice and water. Now he was inside one. The rescue call went out immediately. Alaska State Troopers received the report at 11:42 a.m. Within hours, helicopters and search and rescue teams arrived. Using drones and infrared cameras, they scanned the surface. The team located the moulin entrance and lowered sensors to measure air and water flow. Temperatures inside were near freezing, the water moving at over 50 kilometers per hour. Divers from Juneau's Emergency Response Unit evaluated entry options but ruled them out. The shaft was too narrow, the current too violent, and the ice walls unstable. the risk to rescuers was described as non-survivable. The evidence ledger starts there. Time of incident 11:30 a.m. Location Lower Mendenhall Glacier. Witnesses 2 research colleagues and guides from the Icefield Research Programme. Immediate rescue attempt unsuccessful. Body recovery not possible. By evening, the glacier had begun to shift. Meltwater increased, enlarging the moulin and flooding nearby crevasses. The search continued through the night, but the probability of survival dropped to 0 within hours. Officials from the US Forest Service, which manages the Tongass National Forest, suspended physical entry into the moulin the next morning. The formal statement read, "Due to extreme hazards and ongoing melt conditions, recovery is not feasible." Potsabon's equipment list became part of the evidence. GPS, radio, climbing harness, helmet, and insulated suit. Only a broken pole and a small pack were recovered near the surface stream. Everything else vanished with him into the glacier's interior. In Alaska's summer, moulins can carry water deep into the glacier, hundreds of meters down, where it joins subglacial rivers that emerge at the terminus and feed Mendenhall Lake. Experts estimated that the water flow where he fell was powerful enough to drag a human body through ice channels for several kilometers. If the current did not crush him, hypothermia would have ended his life within seconds. Ricardo Poton was 40 years old. He had built an international reputation as one of the leading figures in planetary geology, studying how the erosion patterns of Earth's glaciers could explain similar structures on Mars. His research had been published in Nature Geoscience and presented at NASA and ESA conferences. He often said that studying Earth's most extreme places was the key to understanding distant worlds. He was known among colleagues for his calm, careful work and for the humour that lightened long field seasons. Swiss camp in Greenland had its Conrad Stefan. Alaska now had its Ricardo Poton, scientists claimed by the very environments they studied. The evidence ledger entry compiled by Alaska State Troopers reads like a cold inventory. Location, 58.45 degrees N, 134.55 degrees W. Victim, Ricardo Poton, Italian citizen. Cause, accidental fall into glacial moulin. Recovery, not feasible, declared deceased at 15:20 local time. The final note, body unrecovered due to unsafe conditions. The glacier, though, is not static. It moves, flows, melts and refreezes. Every day its surface shifts by centimetres. Meltwater tunnels collapse and reform. Some experts say that his remains could reappear years or even decades from now, carried through the ice and expelled near the outflow where the glacier meets Mendenhall Lake. Others believe they may never be found, buried within a moving world of blue ice and black silt. The cold case dossier builds around these facts: the date, the witnesses, the coordinates, the environmental readings, and the halted search. It also includes the human traces, his last radio communication confirming he was near the stream, the notes left on his tablet, a half-finished data log showing melt rates up 15% from the previous week. Those entries were time-stamped minutes before the fall. Potsabon's colleagues, both in Alaska and Italy, later spoke of the risks of glacier work. They said he was cautious, methodical, and always aware of danger zones. But Mendenhall, like all temperate glaciers, changes by the hour. The surface can look solid even as rivers churn beneath. The line between safe ice and collapse can be just a few centimetres thick. Satellite imagery from the day of the accident shows melt streams spreading across the glacier in a branching network. One of those streams ends in a bright blue sinkhole, the moulin where he disappeared. By evening, the satellite passed again, and the hole had widened. A new fracture line appeared only meters from the edge, showing how unstable the surface had been. Officials from the National Geographic Society released a statement calling him a brilliant scientist and a fearless field researcher whose work advanced our understanding of Earth and other worlds. His team in Italy renamed their upcoming Mars analog mission in his honour. In Padua, his university lowered its flag and held a memorial in the Department of Geosciences courtyard. The glacier, meanwhile, kept moving. The moulin where he vanished eventually closed under winter snow. By the next spring, meltwater had carved a new one a few hundred metres away. The old site became part of the glacier's internal memory, sealed, shifting, but never still. Boris Vicefiler, 1985, near Colonia Dignidad, Chile. In January 1985, a 50-year-old Russian-born mathematician named Boris Vicefiler should have been on a simple hiking trip through southern Chile. He was a professor at Penn State University, a US citizen, and a man whose mind was devoted to abstract numbers and symmetry. He had come to Chile to explore, to walk alone in the Andes, and to clear his thoughts after years of academic work. What he did not know was that his chosen route would pass close to one of the most secretive and feared places in the country, a German-run enclave known as Colonia Dignidad. It was a place few outsiders ever approached, and those who did were often never seen again. Vicefiler was an experienced traveller. He had hiked across the Himalayas, the Rockies, and the Andes before. He preferred to travel light, with little more than a backpack, a notebook, and a tent. In early January, he arrived in the town of San Fabian de Alaco, near Chile's Molo region. His plan was to trek alone through the foothills of the Andes, following a trail along the Perquilloquen River, and then cross toward Argentina. He signed the hotel register on January 4th and left the next day. That was the last confirmed sighting of him alive. When he failed to return, a search began. Within days, police found his camp on the bank of the river. His tent was standing. His clothes, camera, and documents were still there. His horse was grazing nearby, saddled but riderless. In the shallow water, searchers found one of his boots. There were no signs of a struggle, but his passport and some money were missing. Local police quickly labelled it an accidental drowning. They said he had likely tried to cross the river and been swept away. But the details didn't match the current. The water was shallow, and there were no tracks downstream. Something didn't fit. The area where his camp stood lay near the border of Colonia Dignidad, a sealed-off settlement run by German émigrés who had fled post-war Europe under the leadership of a former Nazi medic named Paul Schaefer. For years, rumours had circulated about what happened behind its fences: forced labour, abuse, disappearances, and secret police operations during Augusto Pinochet's dictatorship. The colony was effectively off-limits, guarded by armed men, surrounded by electrified wire, and supported by parts of the Chilean military. No one entered without permission, and few Chileans living nearby dared to approach. In 1985, Chile was still under military rule. Foreign visitors were monitored, especially in the central south, where the army maintained outposts and secret detention centres. When word spread that a foreign scientist had vanished near Colonia Dignidad, authorities seemed eager to end the story quickly. The official report said lost in the river. The file was closed. But back in the United States, colleagues and family refused to accept it. Vicefiler's sister Olga began pressing for answers. The witness patchwork built slowly over the following years. Locals in San Fabian spoke quietly of soldiers patrolling near the colony. One farmer claimed he had seen a man matching Vicefiler's description being led away by uniformed men. Others said a body had been taken across the river by soldiers in a truck. None of these accounts could be verified. The police denied everything. The US Embassy in Santiago requested an investigation, but access to Colonia Dignidad was blocked. In 2000, Chile's democratic government reopened several Cold War-era human rights cases, and Vicefiler's name resurfaced. New documents emerged from military archives and human rights reports. Among them was a memo from the Chilean Intelligence Service, dated January 8, 1985, 3 days after he disappeared. It stated that a foreigner of possible Jewish origin had been detained by a military patrol near the colony and handed over to local intelligence. That was the last known official reference to him. The evidence ledger begins to take shape here. January 4th, 1985, departure from San Fabian. January 8th, classified intelligence note on a detained foreigner. February, police file closed as accidental death. The notes show a pattern familiar to anyone studying disappearances under the Pinochet regime: denial, redirection, silence. Colonia Dignidad itself was a place wrapped in secrecy. Founded in 1961, it operated as a self-sufficient commune, but in reality, it was a fortress. Schaefer, its leader, had created a cult that combined religious fundamentalism with paramilitary discipline. Inside, residents were isolated from the outside world, separated by gender and forced into labour. During the dictatorship, the colony collaborated with Chile's intelligence services, providing a site for interrogation, torture, and burial. Investigations after 1990 confirmed that dozens of political prisoners had been taken there and never returned. If Vicefiler had been detained near its perimeter, his chances of survival were almost non-existent. Several former members of the colony later testified that they had seen a foreigner brought inside around that time. One said he was beaten, another claimed he was later executed and his body burned. These accounts came decades later during trials against Schaefer and other colony leaders and could never be fully confirmed, but they fit a pattern of events that surrounded the place. In 2012, declassified US documents revealed that American diplomats had suspected from the start that Vicefiler had been captured, not drowned. A cable from the US Embassy in 1985 mentioned credible indications of military involvement. It noted that the area was controlled by a detachment of the Chilean Army's School of Engineers, and that access to Colonia Dignidad was forbidden even to Chilean officials. The report suggested that local authorities may be complicit or intimidated. Vicefiler's family continued to push for clarity. His sister travelled repeatedly to Chile, meeting with investigators and former residents of the colony. She brought petitions to the Chilean courts, urging them to classify his case as an enforced disappearance. In 2016, a Chilean judge indicted 8 former army officers for kidnapping and homicide in connection with his disappearance. The indictments cited witness testimony and secret police records, indicating that a foreign hiker had been detained near the colony and interrogated at a nearby base. But no remains were ever found. The cold case dossier holds all the fragments: the tent, the boot, the classified memo, the testimony, and the declassified cables. Together they outline a pattern but stop short of a conclusion. The location of his remains is unknown. His fate, execution, imprisonment, or disappearance into the earth is still disputed. Satellite imagery and declassified aerial photographs of the 1980s show the colony's compound surrounded by farmland and pine forest. Beyond it, the terrain rises into the Andean foothills, where Vicefiler's trail would have led. It was a corridor used by both smugglers and military patrols, marked by deep ravines and narrow crossings. The river where his horse was found flows westward toward the Mole Valley, cold and fast but shallow, too shallow to drown a strong man. The witness patchwork includes voices from both sides: the farmer who saw soldiers near the river, a local policeman who admitted years later that the drowning theory was forced, a former Colonia Dignidad member who remembered hearing of a captured foreigner, and human rights lawyers who traced the paper trail back to the Army's local command. Each voice adds a piece, but none can fix the final image. Boris Vicefiler's case remains one of the last unresolved disappearances linked to both the dictatorship and the hidden world of Colonia Dignidad. His story sits at the intersection of two forces: the secretive violence of the state and the closed tyranny of a cult. For Chile, it remains a wound still open; for his family, an equation without a solution. His name endures in university corridors, in legal files, and in the still classified pages of intelligence archives. Somewhere in the hills east of San Fabian, the trail he followed still fades into the same silence where his life vanished. Jean-François de Galaup, Comte de la Perouse, 1788 Pacific. In March 1788, as 2 tall French ships raised anchor from Botany Bay, the coast of Australia watched the last traces of a great Enlightenment voyage slip beyond the horizon. Their commander, Jean-François de Galaup, Comte de la Perouse, was among the most capable naval explorers of his time, a man chosen by King Louis XVI himself to lead a global scientific expedition that would rival those of Cook and Bougainville. The 2 frigates, Boussole and Astrolabe, had already sailed more than 3 years across the world, charting unknown coasts and gathering astronomical, ethnographic, and botanical observations. They carried astronomers, geographers, naturalists, engineers, artists, and priests. When they departed from New South Wales on March 10, 1788, they were never seen again. The journey had begun with precision. La Perouse left Brest, France, in August 1785. His orders were to circle the globe, mapping, documenting, and collecting data on everything from trade winds to native languages. The expedition's composition reflected the scientific zeal of its age: naturalists recording flora and fauna, physicists measuring magnetism, and artists sketching newly encountered societies. His ships reached Chile, sailed through Alaska, crossed to China, Japan, and the Pacific Islands, sending dispatches back to Europe whenever possible. By the time he reached Australia in January 1788, La Perouse had completed much of what King Louis had envisioned. He stopped briefly at Botany Bay, meeting the officers of Britain's new penal colony, before departing for New Caledonia and then the Solomon Islands. The maproom chase begins here at that last confirmed position, Botany Bay, coordinates roughly 34 degrees S, 151 degrees E, stretching northeast into the Pacific, where his route should have led toward New Guinea, then west around the Santa Cruz archipelago. The logbook entries from that final stop survive: calm weather, good condition of the ships, and a promise to return to France by 1790. But after leaving Australia, no word arrived. Years passed. In France, revolution overtook the monarchy, and the world that had sent Perouse to sea dissolved in blood and new laws. Yet the mystery of his disappearance persisted. "Has anyone heard news of Monsieur de Perouse?" the king reportedly asked on his way to the scaffold in 1793. No one had. The evidence ledger begins decades later, with fragments discovered across the Pacific. Islanders from Vanikoro, part of the Solomon Islands, told passing sailors of white men's ships that had wrecked on their reefs long ago. They described survivors who had built a small camp on shore, then vanished. It would take almost 40 years for European explorers to find proof. In 1826, Captain Peter Dillon, an Irish merchant seaman, arrived at Tikopia Island. There he encountered natives wearing French sword guards and using silver utensils marked with fleur-de-lis. Dillon traced these relics to nearby Vanikoro, where the locals told him they had come from two great ships that wrecked in a storm generations earlier. One, they said, had broken apart on the reef. The other had managed to reach shore but was later destroyed by fire. Some survivors had built a small vessel and sailed away. None had returned. In 1828, French captain Jules Dumont d'Urville confirmed the story. When he reached Vanikoro, he found wreckage, anchors, cannons, and bronze fittings buried in coral. They belonged unmistakably to the Beausoleil and Astrolabe. The reef around Vanikoro became the final entry in the expedition's chart. From the recovered remains, historians pieced together the likely sequence. After leaving Botany Bay, the two frigates sailed north toward the Santa Cruz group. There, violent storms drove them onto the reef surrounding Vanikoro. The Astrolabe is believed to have struck first, splintering against the coral. The Beausoleil, attempting to assist, was driven aground soon after. Many of the crew drowned immediately. The survivors, perhaps 100 men, managed to reach the beach with provisions and tools. On shore, they built a stockade and established a makeshift camp. They buried their dead and salvaged supplies from the wrecks. Islanders later recalled that the Frenchmen built workshops, repaired boats, and raised a forge to melt metal. They felled trees to construct a smaller vessel intending to escape. One group may have succeeded in launching it. Oral accounts said the last survivors sailed west, possibly toward New Guinea, but were never heard from again. Among the artifacts later retrieved from the reef were astrolabes, compasses, brass handles, and fragments of navigational instruments, all precision-made and unmistakably French. These items formed the backbone of the expedition's rediscovery. The remains of the camp at Vanikoro yielded nails, iron tools, and remnants of European clothing, confirming that survivors had lived there for months. In the evidence ledger, the items stand as mute entries: copper plate marked Bussola, anchor ring 1.2 m diameter, fragments of porcelain, remains of forge, human bones eroded by salt. Each object narrows the gap between disappearance and discovery. Vanikoro itself was then an isolated island. Dense rainforest, reefs like knives, and a lagoon filled with sharks. For those stranded men, it was both refuge and trap. The sea that had carried them across the world now sealed them in. The tropical rains eroded their camp. Disease followed. Conflicts with local islanders were rumoured. Their letters, journals, and instruments vanished with them. For France, the loss was profound. Perouse had represented the height of its scientific ambition, the spirit of exploration in an age of reason. His disappearance became an enduring question mark in both maritime history and collective memory. In the following century, explorers continued to search for more evidence. In 1964, divers from the French Navy recovered additional artifacts from the reefs off Vanikoro: a bronze bell stamped La Boussole 1785, lead ballast, and fragments of cannons. Later expeditions uncovered hull timbers, bottles, and ceramics matching the inventory of the expedition. These findings confirmed what had long been suspected. The two ships had perished side by side during a cyclone in 1788. Modern underwater archaeology has since mapped the wreck sites in detail. The astrolabe lies in shallow water near the outer reef. The Boussole rests deeper, its wooden structure preserved beneath coral growth. Together they form a submerged archive of 18th century exploration, preserved fragments of a mission meant to map the world but instead consumed by it. The maproom chase that began in the ports of France ends there, beneath the Pacific waves, in coordinates once blank on the chart. The line drawn from Brest to Vanikoro crosses almost every ocean, touching Patagonia, Alaska, Japan, Siberia and Australia before ending in a patch of coral far from any nation's shore. The historical documents that survived outside the wrecks, the journals sent home from earlier stages, provide a vivid record of the expedition's goals and hardships, observations of Polynesian customs, charts of Kamchatka and the North Pacific, meteorological data, and sketches of Pacific flora. Perouse himself wrote with discipline and empathy, describing indigenous societies with curiosity rather than conquest. His letters from Botany Bay included plans for future routes and detailed requests for scientific instruments awaiting him in France. None of those items were ever delivered. The story's evidence remains physical: the wrecks, the artifacts, the coral-bound skeletons of ships that once carried Enlightenment hopes. The reef around Vanikoro still holds them, motionless beneath the current. The lagoon is quiet now, filled with schools of small fish moving through the ribs of decayed hulls. Each tide shifts sand over the anchors and plates stamped with the name of Perouse's ships. The expedition's end is no longer a mystery, but its silence remains, stretching from the decks of the Boussole to the royal court that once awaited its return. Roald Amundsen, 1928, Arctic. In June 1928, the Arctic sky above Tromsø carried the hum of aircraft engines, a sound rare in that frozen world. Roald Amundsen, the Norwegian explorer who had once conquered both poles, was aboard one of them, a French-built seaplane called Latham 47. The man who had reached the South Pole before anyone else, who had crossed the Northwest Passage in a tiny ship, who had lived among the Inuit and mapped the edges of the Earth, was now heading north again. But this time, he was not chasing glory. He was searching for a lost friend. 2 weeks earlier, an Italian airship named Italia had crashed while returning from a North Pole expedition. Some survivors were stranded on drifting ice, their distress signals faint and scattered. Amundsen, at 55 years old, immediately offered to join the rescue. He had spent much of his life in the polar regions and knew how unforgiving they could be. Against the advice of his government and friends, he left Oslo for Tromsø and joined a French crew preparing to fly north from Norway to Svalbard. Their mission: locate General Umberto Nobile and his missing team. On the afternoon of June 18th, the Latham 47 took off from Tromsø, carrying 6 men: Amundsen, pilot René Guilbeault, mechanic Albert de Couverville, radio zoo operator Gilbert Brazy, and 2 others. The weather forecast was poor: low clouds, snow, and unpredictable wind. They planned to follow the coast north, refuel at Spitsbergen, and search the Barents Sea. Witnesses on shore watched the silver aircraft vanish into the fog. It was never seen again. The maproom chase begins with that route: Tromsø to Bear Island, then onward towards Svalbard, a straight line across the Norwegian and Barents Seas, areas already notorious for sudden storms and magnetic interference. The distance was nearly 900 kilometers. Amundsen's plane had limited fuel and primitive navigation tools. If they strayed too far west, they would face the Greenland Sea. Too far east, the Soviet-controlled sector of the Arctic, already on alert after the Italia disaster. Hours after takeoff, radio operators in Norway received faint, broken signals from the Latham. The last transmission came around 6 p.m, though the message was too weak to interpret. Then silence. By the next day, when the aircraft failed to arrive in Svalbard, a massive search began. Norway, France, Italy, and even the Soviet Union sent ships and planes. But the weather closed in. Fog, snow, and shifting ice making navigation nearly impossible. The Arctic swallowed everything. The evidence ledger starts with fragments. On July 31st, more than a month after the disappearance, Norwegian fishermen found one of the plane's floats drifting near the Tromsø coast. A week later, another float washed up farther east. Both were clearly from the Latham 47, confirmed by serial numbers and French markings. The floats had been cleanly torn away, likely by impact with the water. The rest of the aircraft was never found.
But
The area where they vanished was under both natural and political pressure. It lay within what had become a militarized Arctic corridor, watched by Soviet patrols and contested by multiple nations. The search itself was one of the first multinational operations in the polar region. Norwegian and Italian air crews flew side by side, while Soviet icebreakers scoured the Barents Sea. Despite the cooperation, the environment defeated them all. Amundsen's disappearance marked the end of an era of exploration defined by endurance and instinct. Unlike his earlier expeditions, this one had no preparation, no base camp, no supplies for survival. He had acted on impulse, driven by duty and perhaps nostalgia for the polar world that had once defined him. His close friends later said he felt a personal responsibility to help Nobile, despite their strained relationship. Witness accounts describe his departure vividly. At the Tromsø airfield, Amundsen stood calm as always, wrapped in a fur-lined coat, smiling for photographers. He said little before boarding except, "We'll be back soon." The Latham lifted off smoothly, its engines echoing across the fjord. Within minutes, it disappeared into clouds rolling low over the water. Over the next weeks, ships traced the likely path of the flight. They plotted wind directions, fuel limits, and drift patterns. Calculations suggested that the plane likely went down in the Barents Sea, somewhere north of Bear Island. Later studies estimated the impact site between 74 degrees and 76 degrees in latitude, near the edge of the polar ice. But no wreckage beyond the two floats ever surfaced. The Arctic current may have carried the debris under ice or down to the seafloor thousands of meters below. The cold case dossier adds other layers: reports, rumours, and later testimony. A Soviet trawler crew claimed to have seen smoke on the horizon around that date, though no trace was found. A Norwegian whaling ship reported hearing an aircraft engine shortly before a sudden fog bank rolled in. Decades later, explorers using sonar in the Barents Sea thought they detected metal fragments, but none matched the Latham's design. The case remains unsolved, not for lack of effort, but because of the environment itself. The Arctic is both vast and shifting. Ice forms and melts, storms rise and erase evidence, and wreckage sinks quickly into freezing depths. Even modern technology struggles to locate remains in that region. The entries in the evidence ledger end with these coordinates, weather logs, and fragments of correspondence. One letter Amundsen had written before departing Norway was found later among his papers. It read, "If I should not return, do not grieve, I have lived fully." Those words, understated and characteristic of him, would become his epitaph. Roald Amundsen's career had been one of methodical triumphs. In 1903, he navigated the Northwest Passage, becoming the first to complete that route through Arctic Canada. In 1911, he reached the South Pole ahead of Robert Falcon Scott, after years of meticulous planning and study of Inuit survival techniques. In 1926, he flew over the North Pole in the airship Nora, completing the first verified crossing of the Arctic Ocean. Each of those achievements had combined courage with calculation. But in 1928, there was no preparation, only instinct and the hope of rescuing others. The irony of his disappearance was not lost on his contemporaries. The man who had mastered polar travel vanished in the same regions he had conquered, undone not by ignorance, but by circumstance. The Arctic that had made his name now erased his trail. The final verified artifact remains the float, displayed today in the Tromsø Polar Museum. Its weathered metal still bears the mark Latham 47. It is all that physically survives of the mission. No trace of the 6 men aboard, no clothing, no instruments, no remains, has ever been recovered. The search continued intermittently for decades. In the 1980s, French divers organised a sonar expedition over the estimated crash area but found nothing conclusive. In 2009, the Norwegian Navy used modern scanning equipment to survey the seabed near Bjornøya, again without results. The Barents Sea remains one of the harshest environments on Earth, deep, cold, and constantly shifting. Today, the coordinates of the presumed crash are still marked on Arctic maps: 76 degree N, 25 degree E, an area of endless grey water where the fog never fully lifts. Ships passing through sometimes sound their horns in tribute. Pilots flying north from Tromsø cross the same air corridor where the Latham 47 disappeared. Amundsen's empty grave rests in Oslo, beside the explorers who followed him. His legacy endures in charts, journals, and polar stations bearing his name. But in the Arctic, his trail ends as it began, in a place of silence where the sea meets the sky, and no one can tell where one begins and the other ends. Alfred Wegener, 1930, Greenland interior. The wind on Greenland's inland plateau moves like a wall. It carries snow that blinds even through closed eyelids, and the cold cuts through every layer of clothing. In November 1930, somewhere in that white emptiness, Alfred Wegener disappeared. He was 50 years old, the scientist who had first proposed that continents drift, that the world's land masses were once joined and still in motion. His ideas had divided the scientific community, but in Greenland, far from the lectures and debates of Europe, none of that mattered. He'd come for something simpler, to measure the ice, to understand its climate, and to prove through data what maps and theories could not. Wegener was a meteorologist, an astronomer, and a geophysicist by training. But more than that, he was an explorer. He'd already crossed Greenland once, in 1912, pulling sledges across the frozen interior. He knew the risks. This time, the goal was to establish a weather station deep in the island's heart, a place called IJsmitte, Ice Centre. There, a small team of men would endure the polar night to collect continuous meteorological data through the winter, something no one had ever done before. Wegener's mission was to resupply them before the worst of the cold sealed the route. The expedition had started months earlier from the coast near Ammassalik, on Greenland's eastern side. Supplies were hauled inland by dog sled, fuel, food, instruments, tents. The terrain rose steadily until the horizon disappeared into an endless field of ice. IJsmitte sat more than 300 kilometers from the coast, a location so remote that even airplanes of the time couldn't reach it. By October, temperatures had fallen below -50 degrees Celsius. Wegener and a small team made the final push to the station late in the season against advice. The weather was deteriorating. The men at IJsmitte were running dangerously low on food and fuel. If the resupply failed, they would not survive the winter. The team left base camp at the end of September 1930, each man guiding a sled loaded with supplies. The journey took weeks. Along the way, they faced katabatic winds, violent downdrafts that sweep down from the plateau, and near zero visibility. One sled overturned and was abandoned. Men fell ill, dogs froze in their traces. By late October, the survivors staggered into IJsmitte, barely alive. They delivered the supplies and rested a few days in snow huts built into the ice. On November 1st, Wegener decided to head back to the coast. He wanted to reassure the rest of the team that IJsmitte had been reached and to bring back the sick who couldn't stay through the winter. He left with a companion, the Greenlander Rasmus Willemsen, who was younger and skilled with sleds. They packed lightly, some instruments, sleeping bags, and food for a few days. The temperature that morning was -54. The map room chase of their route runs west to east, from the IJsmitte station toward the base at West Camp. It crosses what explorers later called the Dead Zone, hundreds of kilometers of ice plateau where no landmarks exist, only ridges of snow shaped by wind. The path had been marked with bamboo poles on the outward journey, but most were now buried or blown away. The wind erased their trail as soon as they left. They were last seen departing IJsmitte with the sled dogs moving slowly, almost reluctantly. The others watched them vanish into the blowing snow. That was the last confirmed sighting of Alfred Wegener alive. Weeks passed with no word. In December, when conditions eased slightly, a rescue party set out from West Camp to find them. They followed the route east, searching for traces, bits of harness, a broken ski, a scrap of tent cloth. Near the midpoint, they found the first clear sign, a sled half buried in snow, and beside it a shallow mound marked by a pair of skis crossed in the shape of a grave marker. Inside lay Wegener, perfectly preserved by the cold. His face, according to the men who found him, was calm, as if asleep. His notebook was missing, and there were no signs of struggle. They believed he had died of exhaustion or heart failure after setting up camp for the night. Willemsen's body was never found. He had likely continued on alone with the dogs, carrying Wegener's papers and possibly his last notes. He never reached West Camp. The Arctic had erased him completely. The evidence ledger lists the discovery in detail. Date, May 12, 1931. Coordinates near 75° N, 40° W. Elevation about 3,000 meters. Items found with the body: sleeping bag, revolver, compass, empty food tins, tobacco pouch, and a broken watch stopped at 2:30. The grave was shallow, only snow and ice piled over him. The search team recovered the site and planted a wooden cross. Within a year, shifting winds had buried it again. Back at the coastal base, the rest of the expedition endured until summer, when ships could reach them. Wegener's death was reported to Europe months later. His colleagues mourned, but his data, those collected at IceMitter, proved invaluable. They recorded continuous temperature and pressure readings through the darkest part of the Arctic winter, helping to define the behaviour of polar air masses that influence global weather. For the next decades, the exact location of his grave was uncertain. The ice sheet moved slowly but relentlessly, carrying surface snow downward into the glacier. By the 1950s, it was estimated that Wegener's resting place had sunk more than 100 metres beneath the surface. Attempts to locate it by radar and core drilling in later years have failed. His body remains locked inside the ice, moving slowly toward the coast, where it may one day emerge after centuries. The cold case dossier that survives today includes expedition logs, meteorological data, letters, and a few of his final journal entries. One, written shortly before the final journey, reads, "The weather worsens each day, but we must go. The men at IceMitter depend on us. It will be hard, but it is possible." His tone is steady, almost clinical. There is no trace of fear, only duty. His disappearance was not a mystery of politics or conspiracy, but one of endurance and the scale of nature. The Greenland ice sheet that swallowed him stretches for nearly 2,000 kilometres, a desert of white without boundary or mercy. Even modern expeditions have difficulty crossing it safely. For Wegener, navigating it with 1930 equipment meant constant exposure, frozen fuel, and winds that could crush tents flat. Those who studied his route later reconstructed the likely timeline. He and Wilhelmsen would have left IceMitter on November 1st, travelling about 30 kilometres a day at best. Within 4 days, storms increased and visibility dropped to zero. They may have set up camp to wait it out. The temperature at that time reached minus 60 degrees Celsius. The dogs would have struggled to survive. Food would freeze solid. The slightest injury or equipment failure would end the journey. At some point, Wegener's heart simply stopped. The rescue team's testimony paints a picture of silence. They said his camp had been orderly, his sleeping bag zipped, the sled aligned. There were no signs of panic. It seemed he had lain down to rest and never woken up. His companion's footprints led east for a few hundred metres, then disappeared into wind-packed snow. Every expedition since has passed near that region with a sense of reverence. Some have searched for the cross marking his grave, but no trace remains. The ice has reclaimed the site completely. His grave, like his theory, became part of something larger, absorbed into the slow movement of the Earth itself. The last artefacts recovered from the 1930-31 expedition are stored in Denmark and Germany. Weather logs, instruments, and the diaries of his companions. In those notes, one of the last surviving team members wrote, "The professor rests in the snow where he fell, the ice will guard him well." Today, beneath layers of drifting snow and compressed ice, Wegener still lies somewhere under the Greenland plateau. Above him, storms continue to shape the landscape, and the same winds that erased his trail carry the air currents he devoted his life to understanding. Xavier Mertz, 1913, East Antarctica. The Antarctic Plateau in 1913 was a place without colour, just white and wind, endless and cruel. 3 men had set out across it months earlier as part of Douglas Mawson's Australasian Antarctic expedition. Their goal was to map a section of the coast and study its wildlife. Among them was a Swiss mountaineer and zoologist named Xavier Mertz. He was 30 years old, trained in law but drawn to the wild, known for his endurance and quiet resolve. He had joined the expedition to study penguins and seals, but by the time he reached the farthest point of his journey, science had given way to survival. The party consisted of Mawson, Mertz, and Lieutenant Belgrave Ninnis, a British Army officer. They left their base at Cape Denison in November 1912, travelling by dog sled across the most hostile terrain on Earth. The landscape was broken by crevasses, deep, hidden chasms covered by thin layers of snow. The air was so dry that food froze harder than rock, and the wind never stopped. Their sleds carried food, instruments, and supplies for months. By December 14th, they were hundreds of kilometres from the coast, farther east than any human had ever gone. Then disaster struck. As they crossed a patch of seemingly solid snow, the lead sled, driven by Ninnis and carrying most of the food, fell through an invisible crevasse. The snow bridge collapsed beneath him. Mertz and Mawson rushed forward, but all they could see was a black void stretching down more than 40 metres. The sled, the dogs and Ninnis were gone. There was no sound, no movement, no sign of life. The breach and red zone begins there, the instant when exploration turns to catastrophe. The expedition's rhythm broke, leaving 2 men stranded with almost no supplies, more than 480 kilometres from safety. They'd lost their tent, their main food stores and most of their dogs. Only one sled remained, carrying a few days' rations and a small tent. Mertz and Mawson faced a choice: stay and die or attempt to return. They chose to turn back. Their route followed the same line they had used to come, now against the wind. The temperatures dropped to -40. The sun vanished behind cloud cover, and the landscape offered no shelter. They began killing their remaining dogs one by one, eating what they could to survive. It was the only food available: stringy meat and boiled leather harnesses. They fed the surviving dogs with the same flesh, forcing them to continue hauling. For weeks the 2 men stumbled across the ice, pulling their sled by hand. The wind scoured their faces raw, and the snow burned their skin. Frostbite blackened their fingers. At times they fell into shallow crevasses, clawing their way out. Mawson later wrote that the plateau became a maze of blue abysses underfoot, each step a gamble between life and death. By early January 1913, Xavier Mertz began to weaken. He'd been eating almost exclusively the liver of the dogs they killed, unaware that it contained dangerous levels of vitamin A. The symptoms crept in slowly: fatigue, confusion, then peeling skin and swelling. Mawson described his condition in his diary: how Mertz's hair began to fall out, his eyes became bloodshot, and his mind wandered. Some days he spoke in German, shouting for his father or muttering about climbing in the Alps. The evidence ledger records his decline in detail. January 7th. Mertz weak, cannot march. January 8th. Severe pains, loss of control. January 9th. Delirious during night. On January 8th or 9, somewhere on the plateau near 68 degree S, 151 degree E, Xavier Mertz died. Mawson wrote, "He slept quietly and passed away without a sound." Mawson was now alone. The dogs were gone. His sled carried only fragments of equipment and the last of the dried meat. The landscape was a white desert, and the nearest human was weeks away. He buried Mertz in the snow, wrapping him in his sleeping bag. He marked the site with a ski crossed over another, the same symbol later used for Wegener's grave. The wind began erasing it immediately. Within hours there was no trace left, just the shifting surface of the ice moving slowly toward the sea. The red zone here was not a place of war or conflict, but of isolation, the limit of human endurance. Mawson continued alone for 30 days, dragging his sled across the ice, his feet bleeding and his skin peeling from frostbite. His survival was itself a near impossibility, but Mertz remained behind, sealed in a grave that moved with the glacier, sinking slowly into the ice. The conditions of his death were reconstructed later from Mawson's diary and medical analysis. Scientists concluded that vitamin A poisoning from dog liver was the most likely cause, compounded by exhaustion, cold, and starvation. The symptoms matched exactly: hair loss, cracked skin, and neurological collapse. The same condition had been observed in Arctic explorers decades later. Mawson's account of that period reads like a log written on the edge of sanity. He described hallucinations of voices, the sound of footsteps behind him, the illusion that Mertz was still alive and calling his name. He would turn and find only wind and snow. Each night he wrote a few sentences in his notebook, describing how he rationed his food to the gram, how the soles of his feet peeled away from frostbite, how he sewed them back to his boots with thread. He dragged himself forward, one step at a time, across a world that seemed intent on erasing him too. When he finally reached the main base at Cape Denison, months had passed. The rescue ship had already left. Only a few men remained to maintain the station through winter. They found him half-conscious, his face unrecognizable, his hands torn open from the rope of the sled. He weighed less than 100 pounds. The evidence ledger from the expedition was later compiled into Mawson's book The Home of the Blizzard. It lists Mertz's name, his date of death, January 8, 1913, and his burial in snow at latitude approximately 68 degree S. No exact coordinates could ever be fixed. The glacier he was buried in continues to flow toward the coast. meaning that his remains, if preserved, have likely travelled hundreds of kilometres beneath the surface of East Antarctica. Artefacts from the expedition, the sled, fragments of tent poles, and Mawson's diaries are preserved in Australia. But nothing physical remains of Mertz himself. His grave, like so many in polar history, was swallowed by the ice. The glacier that took him is now part of the Mawson coast, its movement still tracked by satellite. It flows at a rate of several metres per year, carrying with it everything it has ever claimed. In the records of Antarctic exploration, Mertz is remembered not for discovery but for endurance, for surviving as long as he did in a place that seemed designed to defeat human life. His loss marked the first death of the Australasian Antarctic expedition and one of the earliest fatalities in East Antarctica's interior. His notebooks and zoological specimens, shipped home before the journey, became part of scientific collections that helped define the region's ecology. The cold case dossier remained simple. Date: January 1913. Cause: starvation and toxicity. Location: Antarctic Plateau. Approximate coordinates unknown. Body: unrecovered, presumed buried in glacial movement. Last witness: Douglas Mawson. The breach began with a step over an invisible crevasse. The red zone extended across the endless plateau, where hunger and cold erased the difference between courage and survival. When the storm finally cleared, only one man walked out, leaving behind the scientist who'd come to study life in the most lifeless place on Earth. R.A. Tingbell's counterpart cases, Antarctic crevasse losses, multiple programs, 20th CA. In Antarctica, disappearance does not always mean mystery. Sometimes it means a step too far, a patch of snow that hides a void, or the sudden snap of ice beneath a sled. The frozen continent has no graves, no markers, only movement. Once someone falls into the ice, the glacier keeps them. Over the decades, dozens of scientists and explorers have vanished this way, swallowed by crevasses that never give anything back. The story of Dennis Tingbell in 1959 is not unique. It belongs to a long chain of losses that span generations of Antarctic research, each one buried in the same white silence. From the 1950s onward, scientific programs from Britain, the United States, New Zealand and Australia established stations across the continent. They measured the atmosphere, ice cores and seismic activity. But between the data and the discovery lay the terrain itself, a landscape cut by invisible fractures, some only centimetres wide at the surface, others yawning hundreds of metres deep. Every expedition confronted them. Flags, ropes and ice drills helped, but nothing guaranteed safety. Even today, satellites cannot map all the crevasses. They shift daily, opening and closing with the movement of the glacier. One of the earliest known crevasse fatalities occurred in 1958, the same year as the International Geophysical Year. A member of a US Navy support team, CB mechanic Richard Williams, was travelling near Little America Vive when his vehicle crossed a snow bridge that collapsed beneath it. The bulldozer plunged more than 30 metres into the ice. Rescue teams tried for days to reach him, lowering lights and ropes, but the crevasse was too narrow and unstable. The attempt was abandoned. Williams' name remains on the US Antarctic Memorial as one of the first lost to the continent's interior. A few years later, in 1965, another case marked the New Zealand Antarctic Programme. A field geologist from the Victoria University expedition fell into a crevasse near the Skelton Glacier. His ropes snapped under tension, and the fall carried him beyond the reach of his team. The glacier was moving at a slow, steady pace, around 1 metre per day. Within hours, the crevasse walls sealed, erasing the gap where he had vanished. The team placed a cairn at the site, knowing that his body would be carried toward the Ross ice shelf, encased in moving ice. Throughout the 1970s, aerial logistics replaced dog sleds, but the risk remained. Helicopters ferried scientists between camps, yet many still travelled on skis for local work. In 1974, a British Antarctic Survey meteorologist fell through a snow bridge near Halley Station during a weather observation. The crevasse was too narrow for descent and the surface around it was collapsing. He was declared unrecoverable within hours. His instruments, anemometers and wind vanes remained frozen nearby, recording data long after their operator had vanished. Each incident added to an unspoken map, the forbidden zones marked by memory rather than coordinates. Teams would flag the sites in bright colours, warning future travellers, but flags disappear under wind and snow. By the next season, the markers were gone. In 1982, tragedy struck again at Cape Bird when a glaciologist with the US Antarctic Research Program vanished during a surface survey. Colleagues found his skis at the edge of a fissure, one pole still upright. The opening was too small to see the bottom. They used ice-penetrating radar to estimate its depth, more than 60 metres, narrowing toward the base. The following day, the temperature dropped to -35 and the surface froze over. A steel plaque was later placed near McMurdo Station, inscribed with his name and the words "Lost in the Ice." The cold case dossier for these events is sparse but repetitive. Each entry begins the same way: location, weather, team composition, time of disappearance. Then comes the line that ends them all: recovery not possible. Antarctica leaves no open cases, only sealed ones. One of the most haunting patterns emerges around the mountain ranges where glaciers flow through narrow valleys, known as blue ice zones. These areas, used for field landings, are riddled with deep fractures formed by compression. Pilots call them glass traps. In 1990, a Twin Otter aircraft carrying 4 researchers from the Australian Antarctic Division struck one during takeoff near the Bunga Hills. The plane sank through the surface as if into water, its nose folding into a cavity of soft snow. Only one wing remained visible for minutes before collapsing. A rescue team arrived within hours, but the crevasse had already widened and sealed. Only fragments of the fuselage could be recovered later that summer. In 1999, a similar event occurred at Patriot Hills in West Antarctica, this time involving a Chilean logistic flight. The aircraft broke through a thin crust of snow during taxi and tilted into a void. The passengers survived, but 2 field engineers who attempted to secure the plane fell through the same opening and were never found. The crevasse was measured at over 100 metres deep, its lower reaches filled with compacted ice water. A new runway was later built kilometres away, marked as the Safe Corridor. The witness reports from such accidents are eerily consistent. There is no sound beyond the initial crack, no scream, no echo. Only the sudden wind of air rushing into the void. Survivors describe standing at the edge of a hole that seems bottomless, blue light fading into black. Attempts to lower ropes almost always fail, the walls shear under weight, sending debris downward. Within hours, snow begins to drift back across the opening, closing it as if nothing ever happened. In the archives of the British Antarctic Survey and the US National Science Foundation, these incidents form a hidden chronology, a list of names, dates and coordinates. Each has a corresponding marker on a map, not as a memorial, but as a warning. Field manuals advise teams to travel rope together, to probe the surface ahead, to avoid crossing snow bridges during midday warmth. Yet every generation of scientists adds another entry to the record. The evidence ledger, built from decades of field reports, reads like a catalogue of absences. 1958, Williams, US Navy, Little America. 1965, unnamed geologist, Skelton Glacier. 1974, meteorologist Halley Bay. 1982, glaciologist Cape Bird. 1990, Australian team Bunga Hills. 1999, Chilean field engineers Patriot Hills. 2016, vehicle operator Princess Elizabeth Station. Each marked body unrecovered. These are not accidents of carelessness, but of environment. Crevasse fields shift constantly, moving with the glacier's slow descent toward the coast. Once someone falls in, the ice closes around them within days. As the glacier moves, it carries them downward and outward, eventually calving into the Southern Ocean. In time, they become part of the ice flow itself, compressed, transported, and released into the sea as meltwater. Scientists studying these processes often pause at this fact. The very ice that consumes them also records them. Layers of snow compact into history, preserving traces of atmosphere, dust, and sometimes human presence. In this way, those who vanish do not leave the Antarctic. They join its timeline. The composite of crevasse losses defines the continent's hidden geography, a map of places where science stops. The forbidden zones are rarely marked on charts, but field veterans know them by feel. The strange hollow sound underfoot, the faint blue glow, the shifting air. Each zone carries a name known only among crews: Bell's Hollow, Williams Gap, Patriot Chasm. They are both landmarks and memorials. Today, technology reduces the risk: ground-penetrating radar, drones, GPS. But the danger remains. The ice moves, melts, reforms. It remembers everything but reveals nothing. The records of those lost to it are thin, but they share a common fate. They stepped where the surface could not hold them, crossed from solid ground into the invisible. The continent closed behind them, erasing all signs except the coordinates typed into a ledger and the faint hum of data still coming from instruments left to measure a place that does not forgive mistakes. Henry Gino Watkins, 1932, Greenland. In August 1932, the summer light over Greenland stretched for almost 20 hours a day. Along the narrow fjords of the east coast, cliffs of black rock cut through the last ice of the season, and meltwater rivers roared into the sea. On one of those long afternoons, a small group of British explorers prepared to go seal hunting near the edge of Tugtillik Fjord. Among them was their leader, Henry Gino Watkins, an experienced Arctic explorer, pilot and surveyor. He was only 25 years old, but already one of Britain's most promising figures in polar science. Within hours, he would vanish into those cold waters, leaving behind one of the quietest and most enduring mysteries in Arctic history. Watkins had spent most of his adult life in the polar regions. He had led the British Arctic Air Route expedition from 1930 to 1931, which had mapped sections of Greenland's east coast and gathered vital meteorological data for future transpolar flights. His leadership combined scientific precision with the instincts of a mountaineer and seaman. He had an easy manner, loved risk, and was trusted by his men. When the main expedition ended, most members returned home, but Watkins stayed behind. He wanted to continue survey work for the Royal Geographical Society and maintain the small base they had built at Tugtillik, a natural harbour carved between ice and mountain. By 1932, his team was preparing to close the base and return to England. The season was ending and the weather was turning colder. Supplies were nearly packed, the equipment loaded onto their motorboat, the Auna. Before departure, Watkins decided to go out for one last seal hunt to gather meat for the voyage and to test the small kayak he used for quick trips along the ice edge. He was an expert with it, having used kayaks for years during his Greenland work. Around 4 p.m. on August 20th, he dressed in sealskin clothing, took his rifle and paddled away from the base. The water was calm, the tide low, and the light still strong. His companions watched him disappear behind a small island. That was the last time anyone saw him. When hours passed with no sign of his return, the team began to worry. They scanned the horizon and fired shots into the air, hoping for a reply. There was nothing. By evening, they launched a search in motorboats, following the route he had taken. They found pieces of ice drifting near the mouth of the fjord, and then the first clue: his kayak floating upside down, half filled with water. Inside were his rifle, still secured by a strap, and his harpoon. Nearby, they found a paddle, one mitten, and part of his sealskin jacket. There was no body. The maproom chase follows that short line from shore to open water, a route less than a kilometre long, yet enough to erase him completely. The search continued through the night, men calling his name, scanning through binoculars under the dim Arctic twilight. The sea was calm, but the air was freezing. Inlets and coves were searched for days. They dragged the area with grappling hooks, finding only floating bits of ice and kelp. On the 5th day they stopped. The witness patchwork begins with those who knew him best. Augustin Courtauld, his second-in-command and closest friend, recorded the events in his diary. He wrote that Watkins had likely fallen from his kayak while aiming at a seal or retrieving a shot animal. The heavy clothing would have dragged him down quickly. The water temperature was near zero. Survival time without a suit would have been less than 2 minutes. He noted that the overturned kayak showed no sign of impact or attack. No tears or bite marks, no sign of collision. Everything pointed to a simple, fatal accident. Another member of the expedition, Quentin Riley, who later became a noted Arctic explorer himself, described the scene differently. He wrote that the kayak had appeared to have been caught in a small tide current between ice floes, and Watkins may have leaned to one side trying to free it. He might have been stunned by the cold or knocked unconscious against the kayak's frame as he fell in. Riley's account adds that they found one of his seal carcasses floating some distance away, suggesting he had already made a successful shot before he disappeared. The evidence ledger from that day is short. Location, Tugtilik Fjord, East Greenland, 65° N latitude. Date, August 20th, 1932. Equipment recovered, overturned kayak, rifle, harpoon, paddle, mitten, sealskin jacket fragment. Witnesses, 6 expedition members at base. Time of last sighting, approximately 4:15 p.m. Weather, calm, clear, temperature near freezing. Result, body unrecovered, presumed drowned. The Royal Geographical Society's report later stated that his death was undoubtedly accidental. But even among his colleagues, there was quiet disbelief. Watkins had survived storms, glacier crossings, and years in the Arctic wilderness. He was a strong swimmer and an expert kayaker. Some wondered if exhaustion, illness, or an unnoticed injury had played a role. Others pointed to the strange stillness of the day, the lack of waves, the absence of wind, the suddenness of it all. Locals from the nearby Amasilik settlement were brought to help search the coastline. They combed the fjord for days, using small boats and harpoons to probe under the ice. They found nothing more. The body of a man in Arctic water sinks quickly, the cold preserves it, but the undercurrents carry it beneath ice shelves and along the fjord bottom, where recovery becomes impossible. The team built a memorial cairn on a rise overlooking the water. Inside it they placed his cap, a compass, and a written account of the day's events sealed in a metal tube. They raised a wooden cross with his initials carved into it. The wind tore it down within a year, but later expeditions rebuilt it from stone. It still stands above the fjord, weathered and covered in lichen, a marker for a man lost within sight of his own camp. Watkins's disappearance struck the scientific world deeply. In London, the news reached the Royal Geographical Society within weeks. Letters poured in from explorers and scientists who had known him, Fridtjof Nansen's associates, airmen who'd flown with him, and students who had worked under his direction. They spoke of his precision and calm, his ability to combine scientific observation with field survival. Newspapers called him the last of the classical explorers, the bridge between the heroic age of polar discovery and the modern era of scientific expeditions. In the years that followed, the Tugtilik base became a minor landmark for Arctic survey work. The remaining team members completed their mapping and returned home, publishing their findings and dedicating them to him. Courtauld later returned to Greenland in 1935 and visited the cairn again, noting in his journal that Gino rests where he loved to be, among ice and wind and sea. The witness patchwork extends to later visitors, scientists and pilots who stopped at the fjord decades later and recorded seeing the memorial. They found fragments of his old camp still intact, the metal frame of a radio mast, wooden boxes with faded lettering and bits of rope buried in gravel. The cross, often rebuilt, became a navigation mark for survey pilots flying the coast. For polar historians, Watkins's loss represents more than an accident. It captures a moment of transition. His 1930-1932 expeditions were among the first to combine traditional sled and kayak travel with aircraft reconnaissance, marking the beginning of modern Arctic surveying. The air photographs his team took helped refine maps of Greenland's east coast and provided early data on glacial retreat. His notebooks, shipped home before the accident, became valuable references for later studies on Arctic meteorology. But his death remains frozen in the same brief span of time: a calm August afternoon, a kayak, and an empty sea. No one saw him fall. The evidence ended with the kayak itself, found adrift and silent, a small shell of wood and skin turning slowly in the current. The fjord where it happened remains one of the quietest places in Greenland. On clear days, when the ice breaks apart and the water lies still, it reflects the cliffs and the cairn on the hill above, marking the point where one of Britain's finest explorers vanished into the water he'd come to study. From the burning sands of Lopner to the frozen fields of Antarctica, their names remain written in maps, journals, and ice. Each of them pushed past the edge of safety in search of truth. None expected the unknown to answer back. Their discoveries moved science forward. Their disappearances left questions that no one has ever solved.